Damn it.
So welcome everyone to another day of the Capra meeting. We'll get started in a little over 5 minutes. Leo is going to be chairing the first session today.
All right, I'm back.
Okay, welcome back. I made you a co-host again.
So you were saying if I want to send a chat to an individual, how do I do that?
In the chat window, there's a to line just above where you type, and by default that'll say everyone. But that's a drop down, which if you click, you can select a particular person.
All right, okay, I see that. Okay,
I believe if you click on their name, you'll also automatically switch over to a private message in the chat box.
Got it, thanks.
Yeah, and again, unfortunately, since you're a co-host, you won't be able to raise your hand. So if you have a question, you get to just ask it.
Sure. So do we have Maarten here? Yes. Good morning, Maarten. Good afternoon.
Morning, afternoon here.
Yeah, you too.
Hey, Maarten.
Hi, how are you? How's everybody?
Can anyone else not help but say good morning, assuming since it's the first talk, it's morning time?
Well, you're all supposed to virtually be in Texas, so it's a bright and beautiful morning.
You'd be surprised too, it's a bright and beautiful morning in England as well. 30 degrees Celsius and the sun is shining hard.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry to have you all locked inside.
Hi, Lior. Just heard your voice.
Hello, Eric.
Long time no chat.
Yes, good to see you.
Well, you're not seeing me.
I know. I can see your name big on my screen.
Yes.
How are you doing?
Yeah, doing fine. Doing fine. I'm spending most of the lockdown in my garden.
Oh yes, me too.
Yeah.
Oh, that same garden that I had the honor of visiting.
Yeah, except we had it re-landscaped recently, so it's a lot better than when you visited.
Ah, that's good.
So how's the family?
Yeah, all happy. They're still at home. I think the little one is going to go to school tomorrow for the first time.
Oh wow, that's a big moment in life.
Yes. Yeah, exhausting. Homeschooling is exhausting. Absolutely.
But I bet the physics curriculum is really good.
At home, oh yes, they know all about constellations and planets and galaxy types, stellar evolution.
Cell force.
Yeah, 4-year-old and 7-year-old, just for the benefit of listeners. Yeah, cell force, we're getting cell force now. No, they seem to be much better, progressing much better than at school, we found, surprisingly, because we don't really put much effort at all into that. It's amazing how young people can absorb whatever you tell them. They can just repeat it forever.
Yes, and they will do that.
It's much harder to educate students at university than it is to, yeah.
Yeah, because they don't listen to you.
Yeah, if they don't listen to you and they don't believe you, even if they do. Whereas your children just believe whatever you say. Yeah, so yeah, but both the girls made huge progress since we started at home.
No, that's great.
Makes me think maybe we should keep them at home.
Yeah, forever.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll mute myself now because I'm sure Aaron wants to begin.
Yeah.
It's always the battle of watching people join, and I try to wait until that sort of stops. But yeah, people have been really prompt. I've been very grateful to you all. For the most part, people have been coming in early. Okay, I think now it's a minute past, so why don't we get started? So welcome again, everyone, to the third day of the meeting. Lior Barak will be co-chairing, so I'm going to turn it right over to him.
All right, thank you, Aaron, and welcome everyone again to the morning session of the Wednesday of the Capra meeting. We have an assortment of topics for this session, and we're starting with Maarten van der Meent, who'll tell us when the mass ratio is small. Maarten, it's over to you.
Thank you, Lior.
I'll just remind that it's 16 plus 4, and I'll give you a quick warning a minute or two before the end of the 16.
Sure, I'll try to keep within time. So can everybody see my screen? Or
yes.
Please can. Okay, excellent. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk. Let's just skip to the introduction. Luckily, Adam has done a great job at pretty much introducing every technical bit that would need to be covered before I get to my results. So we can make the introduction quite short today. So suppose we have this post-adiabatic expansion of a waveform, which will take the form, you'll have a leading term proportional to the inverse mass ratio. In this case, we have the symmetric mass ratio. And compared to what Adam was saying yesterday, as a slow time, I'm actually using the orbital frequency. So we are restricting to quasi-circular non-spinning orbits for the moment here. And as Adam explained yesterday, this first term just requires you to know what geodesics are and what the first order dissipative cell forces. That part is easy. That part we have known how to do for decades almost. The second part in that expansion requires calculating both the first order conservative cell force, which we now also know is also by now pretty routine calculation, but also the second order dissipative cell force, which we saw in the talks yesterday may be close for quasi-circular on-spinning orbits. So this part we almost have. If we would want the next part, the proportional to the mass ratio part in the expansion of the orbital phase, we would need the second order conservative cell force. That part is also in principle close to being calculated. But you would also need the third order dissipative gravitational cell force, which seemed like a very far away option of something to calculate, which we probably wouldn't get to. And if you would need higher terms, it would go on and on like that. And this raises the obvious question, how far in this expansion do we need to go? And this translates into pretty much a question: how big are these coefficient functions in this post-adiabatic expansion? Because if these are all sort of order 1, then this first one is 1 over the mass ratio. For any small mass ratio that will be big, this will still be a significant contribution, but that contribution will always be suppressed by the mass ratio. So will, even for comparable mass systems where nu is a quarter, be smallish. On the other hand, if these coefficients grow, so suppose that this, so the second term we know is order 10-ish from calculations. That one, suppose that coefficient is 1,000,000, then even if the mass ratio is 1 over 1,000,000, this would still contribute an order 1 piece to the answer. And we cannot just truncate the series at 1 PA order. So the question I would like to answer today is, how big are these coefficients, and how far does that mean that we have to go in this expansion for calculating things? And to do this, we'll be turning to numerical relativity simulations. So we're going to see if we can extract these coefficients directly from numerical relativity simulations and get an idea of how big these terms are. In particular, how big the terms are that we're not anywhere close of directly calculating with gravitational self-force techniques. So to do this, we start with 55 numerical relativity simulations from the SXS public catalog, all non-spinning, all quasi-circular binaries with mass ratios between 1 to 1 and 1 to 10. From each of these simulations, we extract the orbital phase as a function of the orbital frequency. And you can do that directly from the 2-2 mode of the waveform. And then to find the coefficients in this expansion, we simply fit a low order polynomial at fixed omega to these results. So on the right, we see an example of one such plot. So the black dots here, so this is taken at m omega is 0.05, and each black dot corresponds to the orbital phase at that frequency normalized by a factor of the mass ratio. And we pretty much immediately see that by eye they lie on a straight line. And you can indeed fit a lot, even if you just fit a linear function to it, that already captures most of the variability in the data. So the blue points at the bottom here are the residual after just fitting a linear function in U. If you add a square term, so if you add the second post-adiabatic term to the expansion, you actually capture almost everything in a numerical fit. So even just looking at this one plot, this seems very promising, because it might have very well been that mass ratios of 1 to 10 are by far not small enough to actually fit the low mass ratio regime of this function. One way to check that this is indeed a good thing is to see if the intercept of this function ends up at the right place. Because the intercept of this function, that's phi 0. That's the one thing that we do know how to calculate with self-force calculations. So we can look at the result for this phi 0 at different frequencies, which is this plot. So this is the adiabatic or 0 PA order of this extraction. And in blue, we see the result of extracting phi 0 from the numerical relativity data. In fact, what we see phi 0 extracted from the numerical relativity data with the 3.5 pn approximation to phi 0 subtracted from the function to reduce the dynamic range. And then the shaded region gives an estimate of the error of our extraction. So this is a combination of both comparing different numerical resolutions, comparing different orders of the fit in nu, and a number of other things related to extracting phi of omega. In red, we see the small mass ratio calculation of the same quantity. So that you just get by integrating the fluxes over the frequency. And these agree very well. So for most of the frequency range, we're well within the error bars of the extraction, except once we start approaching the ISCO. And that is expected because near the ISCO, you would expect this quasi-circular approximation to start breaking down. And in fact, this has been studied, and you get a transition regime to the plunge, which should produce fractional powers of the mass ratio in the expansion for the phase. And in fact, if you do include such powers, this goes away. However, if you include such powers in your fit, at low frequencies, they are very much degenerate with the 1PA and 2PA terms, so you end up with very huge error bars on the rest, so you don't get a very useful extraction. So from here on, we'll ignore those terms and just live with the fact that near the ISCO things aren't as good. Moreover, since the agreement with the SMR result is so good, for extracting the 1PA and 2PA terms, we'll actually fix the 0PA term to the expected SMR value to reduce the number of degrees of freedom. And the fact that this is well behaved is already telling us that this fit is actually a well-behaved thing for extracting these coefficients. Because if this would be any other function than that, you wouldn't end up with the intercept at exactly that point. So having established that, we can look at extracting the higher order PA terms. So we see these in this plot. So in red here, we see the 1PA. So the term, so this is the term with no factor of the mass ratio in the expansion. And in green, we see that an extraction of the 2PA term. So this is the proportional to mass ratio term in the expansion. First, looking at the 1PA, we see that we get a very robust extraction of this function, and it accumulates order 10 radians over this frequency range. One thing this tells us that we cannot neglect this 1PA term when using this expansion, and you can't do this at any mass ratio if you would want to use a small mass ratio expansion for modeling binaries. When we look at the 2PA term, we notice a number of things. One, we notice that over the entire range, the coefficient itself is of the same order of magnitude as the 0PA and 1PA coefficients. This is telling us that the series thus far is very well behaved, and that we don't have to worry too much that the higher order contributions from higher order terms will be much bigger than those of the lower order terms in the expansion. The other thing that we notice is that below approximately 0.0456-ish, this is very, very flat. So there's almost no contribution from the 2PA term. Now, this is slightly misleading in the sense that we know from the post-Newtonian expansion of this term that actually as you go to small frequencies, eventually it will diverge as omega to the -1/3. So it will actually go back down by quite a lot. But it is very flat sort of in the relevant regime of comparison here. And therefore, the contribution of this term over this regime is very, very, very small. In the bottom panel, in gray, we see the residuals of subtracting the 0 PA and 1 PA terms from all the numerical relativity simulations and normalizing by the mass ratio. And we see that all the simulations are essentially have residuals that are much smaller than 1. Again, remember, this is being weighted by the mass ratio. So even for comparable mass, if this says 1, the actual error is less than 1/4 of a radian. Only, again, near the ISCO do things behave slightly badly. And we also see here in orange a hand-fitted envelope function that can be used as a upper bound on what these residuals are. And later on, we'll be using this to give an estimate of where the 1 PA approximation starts to fill. Now, one can question, in those fits, we have used an expansion where we've used the symmetric mass ratio and kept the total mass of the system fixed while doing the fit. This is a choice. In principle, we could have used the ordinary mass ratio M2 over M1 as the choice of our small parameter, and we could have used the larger mass M1 as the mass that is fixed. And in fact, you can do this, and we've done this for any combination of these two choices, giving 4 options. And then here in the top panel, we see the result for extracting the 1 PA term, and in the bottom, the 2 PA term. And the main thing to take from this is it remains true for any of these choices that these coefficients stay approximately the same order. It's not that the 2 PA term starts growing rapidly for any of them. So the series does remain somewhat well behaved. However, this behavior where the 2 PA term is incredibly flat in the low frequency regime seems to be specific for the choice of symmetric mass ratio and total mass. And again, that is not a completely unexpected feature, in the sense that that is the choice that completely explicitly introduces all symmetries of the systems. In particular, the symmetry of changing the 2 masses is correctly represented by that choice. So we'll stick with that choice. Okay, thank you, Leo. So we get to the final bit of the results. So we've seen this plot in several talks already. So this is Lior's version of this plot, which shows the regimes of validity of different approximation methods to the 2-body problem. This diagram, by design, doesn't have any numbers on the axis because it is a very qualitative diagram rather than a quantitative diagram. With the data we now have in hand, we can make a quantitative version of this, and you get something like this. So let me explain what is shown here. In red, we see the region where the small mass ratio 1 PA approximation works. In particular, the red region shows contours of the region where the phase error is smaller than pi over 16, pi over 8, or pi over 4. And in green, we see a similar thing for the post-Newtonian expansion for waveforms starting at infinity, giving the frequency at which they reach this sort of phase error. And then in the bottom, we see the region where we have numerical relativity simulations. And we see that this plot qualitative very much agrees with the plot Leo gave. We have this slanted line here, numerical relativity is slanted the opposite direction. The other thing we see is that these approaches are very much complementary. So in the comparable mass regime, you have, and in small frequencies, you need the post-Newtonian term to complement the 1PA, etc. And again, everything breaks down near the ISCO. Which brings me to the end and my conclusions. So looking at that plot, there's a couple of things we can conclude. One, the 1PA approximation should be good enough for binaries with mass ratios smaller than 1 to 100-ish. You could probably, for those, just use the 1PA approximation on its own, and it will be perfectly fine. Moreover, this post-adiabatic expansion remains very well behaved, even at equal masses, and the error that you get there isn't too big. If you want to model intermediate mass ratios, you'll probably need some combination that includes both the 1PA results and the PN results, and includes some sort of modeling of the transition regime. There's a couple of important caveats to this work. The results here are only for quasi-circular non-spinning binaries. We know that these are unreasonably well behaved to some degree. So adding spin and eccentricity may worsen the picture to some degree. On the other hand, you wouldn't expect it to make it worse by more than an order of magnitude. Second, in this, we haven't modeled the transition regime to plunge. And one thing that this work stresses that we really need to also focus on providing full in-spiral merger or ring-down waveform models based on first principles in small mass ratio perturbation theory, because those could actually be used probably for intermediate mass ratio in-spirals and even closer to comparable mass, maybe. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Maarten. Excellent results. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our 20 minutes. I'll let Eric ask one quick question, please, and then we move on.
Thank you. I hope it's quick. So, well, first of all, great work. And I love that we have a quantitative version of Lior's classic plot. So, I mean, you must have thought about this. So the omega that you put into a self-force calculation is not quite the same omega that comes out from the numerical relativity simulations. And I'm guessing that the mismatch is not very, very big and probably doesn't matter at all. But have you thought about that issue?
So I think the way to do it properly once you get the self-force results is that you actually need to write down the 2 times scale expansion of the phase of the waveform and its frequency, and not the orbital frequency per se. And in principle, it shouldn't be too hard to actually do that in a 2 times scale expansion. And at leading order, there shouldn't be any difference whatsoever. So at the 0 PA, those 2 things should be exactly the same. You would expect a small correction to the phase and the frequency at 1 PA order coming from that. But it should be something that should be completely under control to actually calculate. Please, Adam or other people working on 2 times scale expansions, say if I'm wrong on that. But
you're right. We can very easily re-express it in terms of the exact waveform frequency.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I noticed there were some other questions. I'm sure we'll get back to these results in the discussion this afternoon. So thank you very much, Maarten, again, for excellent results. And we're moving on to Chris Kavanagh. Can you share your screen, please? So Chris Kavanagh, tell us about an analytic calculation of the second order cell force. And the stage is yours, Chris, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so is this working? You can hear me?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, thank you, Lior. And of course, thanks to Aaron for organizing this conference and doing a very good job at it. So I'm going to be talking about analytical second order cell force. So I guess if you thought all the second order cell force talks were over, you were wrong. But for this talk, I'm going to be taking a little bit of a different slant to all the great talks yesterday, in that Well, the main difference is this word analytical. So what we mean here, for those who aren't aware, is post-Newtonian self-force. So it's still self-force in that we expand the field equations in the mass ratio, but then at each order in the mass ratio, we're going to be doing a further expansion in, well, a PN expansion, so a large radius, low frequency expansion. And the idea is there at each order in the mass ratio, you're going to have analytical results for everything you care about. Some things I should say, so all of this work is quite preliminary, and so I guess all comments, all criticisms, all suggestions, any questions will be very, very welcome. This is with Adam Pound, but has benefited really from conversations with a lot of people involved in the second order project. Okay, so I think this is the first post-Newtonian self-force conference this year, or post-Newtonian self-force talk this year, so I thought it'd be a good idea to quickly run through what I think are the good reasons to do post-Newtonian self-force. The first one is, I guess, the most obvious and well-known, is that since we are doing a large radius expansion, the hope is that we can fill up at least some of the parameter space for emeries and save yourself from doing all the expensive numerics in some of these regions. There'll be a talk later today by Chris Munna where he'll probably discuss this further. He might maybe question this word low eccentricity, because I know he's got some rather spectacularly high order and eccentricity expansions to show. The next thing is, well, over the past years, and kind of especially ramping up recently, there's been an interplay between self-force, between classical PN theory, between now post-Minkowski theory, and EOB is playing a pretty central role in this, where we can cross-validate all these different theories and port information back and forth between them. Andrea should be, I guess, mentioning a more recent example of this also later today. And then the last two are perhaps maybe less known, but they're certainly behind the scenes two of the important applications that we have. So I say tool, and what I mean is that, well, we found it quite useful a lot of the time if you're doing a numerical code to have a PN code working side by side, because oftentimes when you're doing debugging and doing regularization, you find that figuring these things out is a lot quicker when you have clear analytical results to compare against. And likewise for the PN theory, when you've got numerics to compare against, you can really find out what's going on very quickly. Lastly, I say hybrid codes. This, I guess, has been mentioned least over the years, but I think has a lot of potential, would be doing a code where you do part of the calculation, which you might not want to do numerically as a PN series. And then at some point, when you stop wanting to kind of carry around big expansions everywhere, you just numerically evaluate everything and plow on with your usual numerical code from there. So at second order, I imagine all of these things will, if anything, be better. So we know that for the second order self-force, there will be the accuracy constraints are a lot lower because it is a significantly subdominant term. So if anything, we can probably fill out a larger portion of the parameter space using PN. With this kind of PM game, well, there was a very interesting paper recently by Bini and Moore and collaborators late last year, where they showed, I mean, maybe I'll be corrected here, but at 5 PN, if you know the second order conservative self-force, you probably should be able to figure out the entire all order in the mass ratio 5th PN Hamiltonian. And then these last two, I guess, haven't been checked yet because there is no second order PN code, but I can only imagine they'll both be extremely useful. Okay, so now we can get to the talk. So the first thing I want to address is, what do we actually know from PN about the first order field? The setup is the usual thing. So we've got a massive black hole of mass m, and then we've got a particle sitting at OR0. Here, and for the rest of the talk, we're going to be talking about circular orbits, so OR0 will be a constant. Now, say we construct PN solutions to the Teukolsky equation. Sometimes we often throw out that these are large radius expansions, but it's very important to be clear what we mean by that. So you might say, so is it that OR is large, our field point OR for, I mean, just think about a homogeneous solution, is OR large? The answer is not quite. So when we're talking about PN solutions, what we really mean is the orbital radius is going to be large. And then in our solutions, the expansion is going to come in that we will say our frequency must scale like the orbital frequency. And the field point OR must scale like the orbital radius. How does this constrain us and how is this different to this expansion? Well, that sticks us in this regime where OR0 is large and our field must be somewhere around here. So if you take your field point R to be out here, much larger than OR0, you will see your PN solution failing. Likewise, if you go down here, this is where it more naturally fails in your mind, but it also fails out here. Okay, so this has been fine at first order in the mass ratio, mostly because our source only has support of the particle, And likewise, when we're calculating things in self-force, like the force, or things like the redshift or whatever you care about, you always evaluate it at the particle. And so these are the only solutions you'll ever need. At second order, of course, we know that this is no longer going to be true. If you look schematically at the second order field equations, you immediately get that your source depends on the first order field, which has support everywhere. And so you're going to need solutions everywhere. Our strategy to deal with this is going to be the following. I'm not going to say a whole lot about this, but just in sketch, we're going to split the domain, much as you would in classical PN theory, into a bunch of different regions. So region 1 here, we're going to try and build up some near horizon expansion, or well, not necessarily near horizon, but just a horizon expansion. Then in region 2, we're going to build our usual PN series expansions. And then in region 3, we'll build a wave zone expansion. And the idea is that ultimately we're going to have to figure out some kind of asymptotic matching at these boundary points, or in some regime where the both series are valid. Okay, well, clearly the gravity problem is extremely difficult, as we saw yesterday. So we're going to move back and try and test out these ideas on something a lot simpler, which is our favorite, flat space scalar field equations. These are going to mimic our first order equations. So we're going to have two fields, phi1 and phi2, which will be our first and second order fields respectively. First one is a source, which is proportional to a delta function. And the second one is a source, which is quadratic in your first order fields. And likewise, we're going to constrain our world line to be a circular orbit. Our method is the same as always. So we're going to do a mode decomposition of our fields, and everything will reduce to radial ODEs with the modes of the sources on the right-hand side. How we solve these is the same as usual. So you construct a set of homogeneous solutions, phi plus and minus. Then your particular solution, phi I, where I is 1 or 2, is a sum of normalization coefficients times these homogeneous solutions. And these normalization functions are integrals, the usual things where you have 1 over Wronskian times an integral of homogeneous solution against source. At first order, this is extremely easy because source is just a delta function and your normalization coefficients are constants, only a function of the position of the particle. And then at second order, you'll see immediately that this integral is really going to have to be evaluated everywhere. And this is where the asymptotic matching is going to come in. Okay, so with this in mind, we have a bit of a to-do list before we start our calculation. First, we're going to have to construct phi plus and minus everywhere, and then split the domain, figure some matching. This part is still very much a work in progress. Well, even more a work in progress than everything else. So I'll probably not talk much about this now. And what I will focus on is the other thing we have to do, which is construct the second order source. But one thing we know from the numerical calculation is, in particular, the local second order source, so the source near the particle, is particularly difficult. This came up a lot in the discussion session yesterday. So I don't think I need to, well, I will elaborate a lot more on why it's difficult, but this is pretty much going to be the focus now of the rest of my talk. One of the useful things, however, and what allows us to kind of make progress pretty quickly, is that the local source only requires first order PN information local to the particle. So this is what we already have. Okay, so what is the deal with the local second order source? Well, there is a paper by Miller, Pound, and Wardell, which I'm going to refer to as MPW 2016, which details why this is a difficult thing to calculate and gives a solution of how to calculate it. This solution is the one that is currently implemented in second order self-force code. Okay, so the thing you need to think about first is, okay, our source is some linear combination of derivatives of your first order field. What do we know about our first order field? Well, we know it as a sum of harmonics, where we just know these radial functions and their spherical harmonics and Fourier series. In practice, we don't obviously know this sum to infinity, but we only really know it to some finite Lmax, which for computational reasons we have had to stop at. And then if you want to construct a single LM mode of this source, you're going to have to integrate this whole thing with two infinite sums put in, well, two finite sums to some finite Lmax against a spherical harmonic. The problem arises in that we're dealing with the retarded field here, and the retarded field diverges at or 0. So these two sums both become very poorly convergent near or 0. And so trying to get an accurate picture of what your second order source is as you get closer to the particle turns out to be extremely difficult. So I've taken this plot from MPW 2016. It is figure 1. Every plot I'm going to show is pretty much a version of this plot, so hopefully I'll try and explain it properly. On the y-axis, we have the second order source, or a mode of the second order source, namely the L equals 0, M equals 0 term. And on the x-axis, we have delta or, which is the distance from the particle. So 0 is where the particle is placed. And what they did was they plotted it for a bunch of different L max values. And you see that near the particle, as you increase L max, the thing is just going up and up. You're not converging to anything specific. And so you can never really know when you are near the particle if your solution is correct. And in principle, if you really wanted to converge to something, you would need L max to just be some arbitrarily high number. So clearly you need another method of doing this. And what they came up with was, well, you take your retarded field, you split it into a regular piece, which should converge with L, and a puncture piece, which you know from calculating first order punctures. And then you put this into your source and you get 3 terms, one which is quadratic in the regular piece, one which is regular times puncture, and one which is puncture times puncture. These 2 pieces, because the regular field is converging with L, the L infinite, well, the double infinite L sum converges with L max. And so you can actually truncate it and get an answer which is correct. The last piece, which is where all the L mode divergence is, well, you know the full 4D form of this puncture. You don't just know its LM modes. And so you can just square it and integrate against YLM directly. Okay, great. And here is the same plot I showed you before. 0, 0 mode of the source, delta or, and the blue line is what they get. And this is a correct 0, 0 mode of your source. So to get the right answer, basically they've introduced 2 mode coupling sums and a numerical integral. And as Adam said yesterday, this is by far the most expensive part of current second order codes. He said something like 99.99% of the computational time. I'm not sure how many digits that's accurate to, but you got the picture. Okay, so we're a bit worried about what we're going to do at PN if this is such a big problem, but it turns out the situation is much, much, much easier. The reason is that while in numerics, you're limited by some finite L max, in PN, you can actually construct your solutions as closed form in L. So you know all L to infinity. What this allows you to do is, well, okay, you look at your infinite sums. So one thing to note is these are integrals, but in reality, they're integrals of just harmonics. So they're triple integrals of harmonics. You know these, they're Clebsch-Gordon coefficients. This constrains the value of the L's with each other. So L2 is between, once you fix L, it's between L1 and L, between 2 values of L1. L minus L1 and L plus L1. So you can rewrite the sum just as a sum in L1. It turns out, since you have those closed forms, that you can write an individual term in the L1 sum analytically. So this is just the 1PN term, where epsilon is position of particle divided by or. This sum can, it also turns out, be taken to infinity. And you can arrive at, without doing almost any work, closed form solutions for the modes of your source without doing any puncture regular split. This is just straight from the retarded field. So you see here, if you have a look at this, well, there's an epsilon squared minus 1 square term. Epsilon is or 0 over or. So as you approach the particle, this is exactly where the divergent part of your source is. So it's coming out in closed form here. And you see that in every order, every PN order, you see that. Okay, well, now that we have this, we can just compare to the numerical solution. So just to say, acknowledge Barry Wardell, he shared some of his code with me to reproduce the solutions that they did for their paper. So this is exactly the same plot I showed you before, except it's just for delta or positive. So it's only half of the plot. In black dots, it is the puncture solution, which was the solid blue line in the previous plot, and the red dashed line is the PN. So yeah, you can see that we are reproducing their method very easily. This is at 0 equals 10. And then you can change or value, and you see it's still reproducing the numerical results very nicely. Great. So this is telling us that the infinite mode coupling problem is not a problem for PN. So we can actually just move on to the next stage of our calculation, which is great. However, there's something else you could do, which is, well, maybe you can just compute the second order source with PN and then numerically evaluate it and use that as the source for your already available numerical self-force codes. That would, in theory, cut out a lot of work because this can be evaluated for arbitrary radius immediately. Okay, that's pretty much where I'm going to leave it. Now I'll just talk about what our plans for the future are. Well, what I've said so far is all for flat space. So it would be very nice to get a good few PN orders of the same second order solution in curved space and check how this converges with PN order and how far into the strong field we can go and get however many digits of accuracy. Maybe the more fun thing to do is going to be implementing this asymptotic matching, particularly in flat and in curved spacetime, and really do an end-to-end PN calculation of a second order field. That's just for toy models. For gravitational self-force, well, the Teukolsky approach is beginning to look quite good. There was talks by Andrew Spires and Sam Upton yesterday, which seem to be giving a good idea of how we should approach the Teukolsky equation in second order. Likewise, there's some talks after me now, Peter Zimmerman and Stephen Green, about second order Teukolsky. So it'll be great to see how they are looking. And I like to highlight Leanne Durkin's talk on Monday, where she showed that MST is pretty much set up for Lorentz gauge now. What this means is that we can pretty much immediately do PN directly in Lorentz gauge. This could either be used to do a full PN second order calculation, or perhaps more quickly, we could really implement this second order source idea and see if we can do second order calculations using PN. Okay, that's all. So hopefully next Capra, I'll have more results about this.
Thank you, Chris. Right on time. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. Questions, anyone? Justin. Go ahead, Justin.
Yes. Great talk, Chris. So back on this, back a few slides before the plot. I guess, so to make the plot, you had a finite number of PN orders, is that?
Yeah, this is 3 PN orders.
Okay, so back 1 slide, maybe.
Forward?
Yeah, that, the longest equation.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Yeah, so it's these 3 PN orders that are shown on the next slide only.
That's right.
Okay. But the divergence at r equals r naught is present at every PN order.
Correct.
And do you expect that to continue?
Yeah, I mean, it makes it look like the series is a bit dodgy, because I guess at each order you want to be smaller than the last order. Is that your concern?
No, I'm just curious if that's the structure that you see.
Yeah, so far it seems to be.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. Okay, that's all for now.
Else? Question for Chris? All right, so yeah, I'm sure we'll discuss this work as well later today. So thank you very much. Oh, we have a question from Niels. Niels, you can still ask if you want.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. I had to change my microphone earlier. Yeah, I just want to say that I think the hybrid approach that you're suggesting sounds very interesting as a kind of blending of the 2 methods. Obviously, great if we can do things in full PN, but yeah, it sounds like we might do something on a reasonably shorter time scale with a hybrid approach. And so no real question. I think it's just, that sounds like a very nice idea.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, thanks again, Chris. And on to Stephen. Stephen, are you ready to share?
Yeah, let me just set up my screen share.
So you have Stephen Green on the Teukolsky formalism for nonlinear perturbations. And
Okay.
Brad.
Okay. I'm just trying to find my desktop. Too many windows open.
Well, I'll tell you in
Okay, got it. Okay.
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 Looking good.
Good. Oops. Okay, so everybody can see my slide, hopefully.
Yep.
All right, so I'm going to talk about some work I did with Stefan Hollins and Peter Zimmerman, which was published earlier this year. Title is Teukolsky Formalism for Nonlinear Kerr Perturbations. So what we would like to do is obtain metric perturbations from point sources, but in Kerr, but take advantage of the Teukolsky equation. So the Teukolsky equation, of course, simplifies things greatly compared to trying to solve the linearized Einstein equation, because it's a separable equation for one scalar field. But obtaining the metric perturbation is a bit of a challenge, especially if you're in non-vacuum. In particular, the standard CCK reconstruction doesn't work if you have any source. So as this was put by Ori in 2003, if at first order, there's no solution in the shadow of the source. So what this means is, these techniques, they could involve, for instance, integrating ordinary differential equations along, say, an outgoing principal null direction, starting from the horizon, as I've shown in this figure. And once you integrate, you hit this source, and then the shadow of the source is everything beyond that source along this curve. So this is what gives rise to these well-known string singularities. But moreover, it would be a problem even if you had extended sources, because anywhere in the shadow of that source, you would not have a solution. Now this gets even worse at second order, because you have a non-vanishing source anywhere made up of the second order Einstein tensor built out of your first order solution. So you don't have any solution anywhere. So what we're interested in doing is fixing this up and finding metric perturbations even in the presence of sources. So to begin, I'm going to give an overview of the Teukolsky formalism, just to put everybody on the same page. So in particular, I'm going to use this operator formalism. So suppose you have linearized Einstein equation about Kerr, which I'm writing up here. The operator identity is this identity that says if you apply this second order differential operator S to the Einstein operator, linearized Einstein operator E, you can rewrite this as another operator O, the Teukolsky operator, acting on the operator that gives you the curvature scalar. So this gives rise then to the Teukolsky equation, because you could say, okay, the Teukolsky operator acting on the curvature scalar, well, that's OT of H. Then you can rewrite that using the operator identity as S E H. And then E of H is just the Einstein equation. So then you have is the Einstein equation. So then this is just the Teukolsky source. Somebody's in the background there.
Will we go fast?
I think somebody's microphone is on.
I muted him.
Okay. Yeah. So that gives you then the Teukolsky equation from using that identity. Which I'm just writing out here, and using the GHP notation, where the thorns and the F's, these are directional derivatives along principal null directions. Okay, but you typically, of course, need the metric perturbation, not just the Weil scalar. And what is amazing about the Teukolsky formalism is that also gives you a way of going that direction. And as Bob Wald explained in 1978, you can take the adjoint of the Teukolsky identity of the operator identity to get E S dagger is equal to T dagger O dagger, and then that enables you to go from a solution to the adjoint Teukolsky equation, this O dagger phi equals 0. If you act then with S dagger on your solution, then the H the quantity of the results is a solution to the linearized Einstein equation by very similar arguments to previous slide. So this phi here, this is called the Hertz potential. So just to summarize what we have here, if we have a Hertz potential, a solution to the adjoint equation, we act on that with S dagger, then we get a solution to the linearized Einstein equation H. And if we act on a solution H to the linearized Einstein equation, we get a solution. If we act on that with T, then we get a solution to the Teukolsky equation. So we have a Hertz potential, a metric perturbation, then a Weyl scalar. Now, the problem comes in if we have a Weyl scalar and we want to get back a metric perturbation, because first we have to go all the way up to get a Hertz potential, which requires us to invert a fourth order differential operator, T S dagger phi is equal to psi 0, and also subject to the adjoint Teukolsky equation. Now that's totally doable, but the more serious problem is this only works in the vacuum. So, and the easiest way to see that is that the H that results from the S dagger operator is an ingoing radiation gauge, and meaning that H dot L is equal to 0 and H is traceless. That's 5 conditions which you cannot generically impose on a metric perturbation. And in particular, it implies that the LL component of the linearized Einstein equation has to vanish. So you can't have any LL component of stress energy if you want to be able to do this. So this is the problem that we're going to set out to solve. So the main result is that we show that if you have HAB satisfying the linearized Einstein equation with source, then you can decompose it in the following way. Now, there are some restrictions on TAB at H that I'll get to, but for now, let's just go through this. So we have one piece, which is just pure gauge. Another component, which is so-called zero mode, which is a perturbation to another Kerr background solution. Then there's a piece that arises in the standard way from a Hertz potential, but now this Hertz potential satisfies a Teukolsky equation with a source. And then finally, you have a piece called the corrector tensor. Now this is, which is the new piece. And this is obtained by integrating 3 decoupled ordinary differential equations along outgoing principal null directions. So it's straightforward to find this term. And that's what I'm going to explain how to do next. So now most of the rest of the talk is just going to be a sketch of the proof, which is instructive because it's related to the construction of all of this stuff. So if you have some H satisfying the linearized Einstein equation, then the first step is to make a gauge transformation to set H dot L equal to 0. That's 4 conditions. It's always possible to do this. Then the next step is to pick the XAB in a suitable way. So what we want to do is use the X to deal with all of the problematic components of the Einstein equation. In particular, the L components, because if you recall earlier, the LL component was the problematic one. So I'm going to pick X to satisfy this equation, and I can do that if I choose an ansatz for X, which has MM bar components, and M components, NM bar component, and NN components. And when I just write out this equation in components, it turns out that I get a nested set of ordinary differential equations along LA, the outgoing principal null direction. So the first equation, if we look at it, it's the left-hand side is this ODE along L and acting on X, M, M bar, and the right-hand side is just TLL. So we can integrate this equation and get X, M, M bar. So integrate starting from the past horizon out to future null infinity. The second equation is an equation for X, N, M, also an ODE. And the right-hand side of this is the LM component of stress energy and some terms involving X, M, M bar, which we've already calculated. So we can solve this and get X, N, M. And then the final equation is an equation for X, N, M with the same sort of structure where we can calculate the right-hand side based on the components we've already calculated. So we can integrate that and get the final part, X, N, N. Okay, so now we can just redefine H to remove or take out the X component, and now we still have H dot L is equal to 0 because X dot L is equal to 0. But now this H satisfies an Einstein equation with a source that has vanishing L components because we've dealt with all of those with the X. Okay, so we've disposed of those components, and now we're going to make a few more assumptions on T and H, as I stated earlier. So we're going to assume T, the stress energy, is smooth with compact support, and that H is the retarded solution. So T, I've illustrated that in this figure here. So TAB has some compact support, and then since H is the retarded solution, it only has support in the region indicated. And then in particular, H vanishes in a neighborhood of the past horizon. So we can look at the LL component of the Einstein equation, and that is an ordinary differential equation for HMM bar. And it has a polynomial solution in rho. And since it vanishes in a neighborhood of H minus, the past horizon, all of the polynomial coefficients also have to vanish, and therefore HM bar M vanishes everywhere. So with this is an additional condition on H, and this in fact implies that the trace vanishes, so the metric is an ingoing radiation gauge automatically. Now, finally, we have to show still that H can be written as the real part of the S dagger operator acting on some Hertz potential phi. So written out in components, there's 3 components to this equation, which I've written here. And we can solve the first component equation to get the phi. And we impose that we take the solution to be 0 in the past. And at the past horizon. And then by arguments similar to what I had on the previous slide, both of the remaining equations also hold automatically. Okay, so now we've written that H is S dagger of some phi. So that's done. We're done with the proof. And so we've established this decomposition for HAB. But we still don't have the equation for phi, but that's easy enough to get. We can just assume our decomposition now. And if we apply the Einstein operator to this expression, then, well, whenever it hits the leak CG term or the G dot term, well, it just vanishes. Then when the Einstein operator hits the H and X, those combine to give us that new source that we had a few slides ago, this SAB on the right-hand side. And then we use the operator with that last term, and then we find that the real part of T dagger, O dagger phi is this effective source that we had earlier with no L components. So if we, and we can then we just see automatically that O dagger of phi here on the left-hand side, that's equal to eta, where eta must satisfy the equation real part T dagger eta is equal to this effective source. So we can just integrate this equation. We're going to integrate the m bar component. And again, we have an ordinary differential equation along the outgoing principal null direction for eta with this source that's known as S m bar. So to summarize this procedure, to get a metric perturbation that solves E of H is some stress energy, we integrate 3 ordinary differential equations along the outgoing null geodesics to obtain the corrector tensor X. We integrate 1 ODE along the outgoing null geodesic to obtain the source eta. Then we solve the adjoint Teukolsky equation with that source. And then we can just set H is equal to that corrector X plus the part constructed out of the phi. Alternatively, you may be given a Weil scalar that solves the Teukolsky equation, and that's fine. Then you can just obtain phi by integrating a certain 4th order radial ODE along L, and then add the corrector tensor in the end. There's just a couple comments on what I said. So I made some assumptions on TAB, wanted to say that the proof would also follow for distributional stress energy, in particular a point particle. And then with regard to the compact support assumption, that can be relaxed to some degree, if we instead impose sufficiently fast decay at the past horizon. So what this means then for a point particle is that we have an algorithm that gives a distributional solution to the linearized Einstein equation, in contrast to standard approaches that fail along the string. And Peter's going to talk about that in his next talk, how to apply that. And then, I mean, we had a couple other applications in mind when we developed this, which if we were interested also in interactions between quasi-normal modes and possibly applying this to write out, say, an action for perturbative quantum gravity in terms of Hertz potentials. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Right on time. We'll get to Aaron in a moment. We had a question in the chat from Leo Boko. Is the gauge condition, the radiation gauge condition, consistent with the retarded boundary conditions?
Yeah. So the gauge. So I mean, maybe I'll find the expansion. Okay. So here I've written the expansion. Yeah. So we're integrating. Maybe I didn't say it clearly enough. So the X, for instance, is not going to satisfy the ingoing radiation gauge condition. So H does not satisfy the ingoing radiation gauge condition anymore because that's not consistent with having sources, as been shown in the past. X is going to I mean, when we integrate these ordinary differential equations to obtain X, we have to start it with zero value at the past horizon. So it's going to satisfy this retarded condition along with everything else.
All right, thank you. Aaron, you had a question?
I was actually just clapping. Really great talk. Thank you. No questions right now.
Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? Leo, does that answer your question? All right. Any other questions? If not, I'll thank Stephen again, and moving on to Peter. You can try sharing your screen. Peter Zimmerman, on the same topic, on an application of what we've just seen. So it's all yours, Peter.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and I can see your slide as well.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to take over from Stephen and extend the work that we've been doing on extending or taking Teukolsky formalism to generate nonlinear perturbations into a more self-forcey context by applying it to point particle motion. This is work I've been doing with Stephen, Stefan, Andrew Spears, and Adam Pound. Andrew has been doing most of the legwork on calculating, so I just want to give him a special shout out here. He's been doing a great job. The motivation is that we want some way to get a metric at second order for self-force, which doesn't involve having to solve the linearized field equations and dealing with Lorentz gauge issues or coupling between components or all of these things that come with the Einstein field equations. And we want more than just a dissipative piece. Andrew talked about what might be done with Teukolsky formalism to give the dissipative piece yesterday. But in fact, we want more than just that. There's information in the full metric which can, for instance, inform other approximations such as post-Newtonian theory. And I think recently it's been shown that if you have some if you have the full second order self-force information, you can get very, very high PN results out of it, 5 or 6 PN, I don't remember exactly. However, for this, we need a well-defined, particularly integrable second order source. And as a prerequisite, one needs to control first order singularities first off. For instance, in Maarten's code, which uses a reconstruction procedure, the first order metric is distributional. And so if you plug it into the second order Einstein tensor, which is quadratic in the first order perturbation, you're multiplying distributions, and it leads to an ill-defined second order source. It's not even just not integrable, it's just, it doesn't even make sense. So that's a bit of motivation. And so what we've done is we've extended the Hertz potential formalism in Kerr, so we have a way to go to higher order without having to solve the linearized or second order field equations. But how does it work in practice, say for a point particle? So what we've done so far, and this is just very early stages of this calculation, this project, is we've done just a warm-up Twymata where we've calculated everything for the simple static particle and flat spacetime scenario. And we have results for this which are completely analytical, and this allows us to comment on some singularities, issues going to second order, and how things might generalize to Kerr. So I'm just going to quickly review some things that Stephen talked about. So we want to use a metric reconstruction procedure. Lorentz gauge field equations are nasty, so that's why we want to use it. And the normal CECK procedure generates radiation gauge perturbation through this so-called metric reconstruction technique. So you have a solution of the Teukolsky equation, you invert the fourth order operator, you act on that Hertz potential with the second order differential operator, and out comes your radiation gauge metric. However, because these metrics are orthogonal to one of the principal outgoing null directions and trace-free, there's too many conditions, and so something has to give. So certain components of the stress energy have to be 0, and this will be generically violated. Again, to sort of recap what Stephen said, these radiation gauge metrics need a completion or correction piece to satisfy the linearized Einstein equations when sources are involved. So in particular, they fail in the shadow of the source. So for a point particle, this leads to these strings emanating from the world line to infinity. And we now have a constructive procedure for generating source to higher order perturbation solutions via this corrector field X, which is determined by simple differential equations. So this is a summary again. I'll just glide over this. So we have 3 ODEs to determine X, eliminating the bad components of the stress energy. We integrate one ODE along the null congruence to get the source eta for the Hertz potential. We can decompose the Hertz potential into modes to solve for it. And then we can generate a solution up to gauge and perturbations to nearby spacetimes by adding this corrector field to the piece coming from the Hertz potential. Okay, so now to get to the detailed calculation we did in flat space. So we just considered a static particle of mass mu sitting at position xp. We work in outgoing coordinates. So u is retarded time here. And we install a null tetrad in which the stress energy, which is the static stress energy, has the frame components given by TLL and TLN. The rest of them are 0, and these are just typical delta function sources. We solved for the metric perturbation to flat space from this particle using the GHP formalism, which generalizes very nicely to Kerr or any algebraically special space-time. And in this setup, particularly on static fields, the GHP operators have very simple geometric forms. So these Thorn primes are just radial derivatives. And the angular operators are just the spin raising and spin lowering operators on spin weighted spherical harmonics. So we're going to use those in our calculation to turn all angular derivatives into just algebraic relations. We take the same ansatz for the corrector field, which is built into our formalism. I'm not sure if it's necessary, but it's the one that we chose. The components are entirely determined by the source, as Stephen said, and they satisfy a hierarchical set of equations along the null race. So once you have TLL, you get the first component of X that you want, sort of spin 0, 1, and then from there, you can generate the other two just by integrating ODEs. And in flat space-time, these are very, very simple and can just be integrated by hand. And what we find is that there's sort of an IRG or radiation gauge violating component, which will never be canceled by S dagger phi, or the thing coming from the Hertz potential to the metric, because this is a pure trace. And as you recall, the radiation gauges are trace free. So this thing really must be added to get a solution. It can't be gauged away. So the corrector X sources a Hertz potential via the source eta. So in Teukolsky language, this is given by the stress energy minus the Einstein tensor acting on the corrector field, sourcing eta through this T dagger operator, which takes spin minus 2 scalars into spin 0 symmetric 2 tensors. This becomes very, very easy in flat space. And we can just solve it by hand. And we find that eta is just proportional to X. So it also has this property of a Dirac string extending to infinity, but it's slightly more regular at the particle, slightly more singular on the sphere, because there's a derivative acting on this delta function on the sphere. We use the symmetries to solve the sourced Teukolsky equation mode by mode in a basis of spin minus 2 spherical harmonics. And by imposing regularity at large and small radii, we find that the Hertz potential decomposes into a Coulomb plus a string solution. And what I mean by this is that there's a Coulomb piece which is symmetric under interchange of the radius of the field and the radius of the particle. And the modes converge in L. And at large distances, the field just has the Coulomb fall off. And the string piece, which is supported for radii greater than that of the particle, the modes diverge in L, have to be summed distributionally, and the field blows up at large distances like r to the cubed. When we add these two things together, so we have the corrector fields and we have the piece coming from the Hertz potential, we notice that the metric has cancellations in all components but the MM bar component, which was the pure trace, which could have never canceled because it was this piece is the radiation gauge piece. Whether this generalizes to Kerr, we don't know, but that could be interesting to explore. We find that inside the metric, or inside the particle, the metric's modes are purely Coulomb, all scaling as r to the L. Outside the metric is both Coulomb and singular string content in the component's tangent to the sphere. So we have spin 0 component, which is just equal to the corrector. We have a spin minus 2 component coming from the piece from realized dagger phi, and a spin minus 1 component also coming from there. And we have string modes, which we can actually do these sums over L and M. We've done them in a way in which we've had to regularize, but we can probably justify this more rigorously. We find that the summed modes sum to something which is too singular for a second order source. So we're still left with this pure trace piece, and there's other pieces which are more complicated, but we have them as well. They have similar structure of strings. So the string leads to an ill-defined second order source, but as our approach generalizes to higher order perturbations in Kerr, we'd like to work with a more regular first order metric. So we define a gauge vector such that the gauge transformed perturbation has no string singularities away from the source. By this we mean we eliminate all but the Coulomb pieces. And this just leads to this simple set of equations where these angular derivatives, again on modes, just become algebraic or just turn into products. And this produces so-called no-string solution. So we've gone from a string extending from the small body to infinity to something with no string. But what we find is that this just leaves us with a completed no-string metric perturbation, which was already known in the literature. But we found it constructively. We didn't have to add any completions piece, which had been problematic before. It required some special sort of less constructive mechanisms to get it. And in this no strings perturbation, the singularity is restricted to the sphere r equals r particle, and it's smeared over. So what I mean by that is that the LM modes have the form of delta function sitting at the particle times some YLM behaviors, and these YLM behaviors sum to something like log of the angle between the vectors x and x prime. And all the non-zero tangential components are just of the Coulomb form. And so these are somehow well behaved, and we know how to deal with these. Now in flat space, these singularities on the sphere can be smoothed out mode by a gauge transformation because we know the coefficients exactly. So we just know these coefficients, and we can pick a piecewise gauge vector just to remove them. However, in Kerr, this might be more difficult. So how do we generalize to Kerr? Well, many pieces of the Kerr calculation are already in place. For instance, the string part of the Hertz potential can be extracted from Ori's work, I think it was 2003, in the high L behavior of the modes of this Hertz potential. Maarten's code computes the no string metric up to certain coefficients for the delta function on the sphere, which we actually can provide via the corrector, provided we can generalize to Kerr. The flat space-time calculation gives us a lot of insight into what's left to do. In Kerr, the corrector tensor still follows ODEs along the outgoing principal null direction. So we expect to still be able to get it analytically, because we can just solve these ODEs, or at least semi-analytically, or have to do that one on each theta, which would not be too bad. And we notice cancellations in all components of x by the piece coming from S dagger phi, leaving all but the radiation gauge violating component. We wonder whether the same will be true in Kerr, or whether this is something particular to just static fields or flat space background. Now what we have is a way to get the complete linearized metric perturbation. But what we really want is a well-defined second order source so we can go further with the method. For that, we're considering a few options. So one is we can transform to a Lorentz gauge, or from there a highly regular gauge, where the second order source is integrable. And this, maybe we can solve in a similar fashion a scalar wave equation to generate the gauge vector from a scalar potential. Another option is we keep the half string solution and regularize it somehow. It's not clear how to do this rigorously or how this might work in practice, but it is an option worth exploring. Another option is to use the no string metric and regularize it mode by mode with the gauge transformation. This seems to be straightforward in spherical symmetry, especially in GHP, where the angular derivatives just become algebraic. But in Kerr, this could be more problematic because radial angular coupling. So you'd have to match the coefficients of the delta functions on the sphere, but these would have non-trivial angular profiles. So you'd have to be matching essentially at each data angle. Another option we're exploring is to use a local puncture scheme to replace the source, the distributional stress energy, by a local expansion of the near zone metric of the body. And I'll leave it at that, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks very much. Any questions? We have a few minutes. Okay, Chris.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for the talk. Very nice. For the fourth point, using a puncture scheme, are you talking about using a puncture at first order and then kind of going through the calculation with a puncture?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Do you see any, is it perfectly fine? Like the puncture is going to introduce some extra distributional things at the boundary of the puncture, possibly. Is that an issue or no? That's totally fine.
I haven't thought about it that far yet. I'm still thinking what order we would need to go in the puncture for it to lead to a well-defined second order source in our method. But yeah, this could be an issue as well with to do with the boundary, and if there's well, I think if you go to sufficiently high order, doesn't the matching at the boundary not such an issue?
I don't
know. So I was thinking of this with a window function, so it would go smoothly to 0.
Ah, I see. Yeah. So then we wouldn't have. So we'd have a puncture plus a window function, and then we wouldn't have to deal with a sharp boundary.
Yeah.
Can I ask something quickly, Peter? That's a great progress since we talked in Southampton just a few months ago. When we talked, I remember there was a concern or an issue with the solutions for the corrector tensor blowing up at infinity. Is this solved simply by taking the correct boundary conditions for your ODEs?
I think we just had the wrong solutions on the board.
That's so. Okay.
Let's see, we had. Let's see. Can I try to find the corrector tensors? Components here. I see.
Yeah. Well, naively, when you integrate over the ODE operator, you can pick up polynomials in R at infinity. I suppose you can just set them to 0 by picking your boundary conditions at infinity. Anyway, let's discuss it there.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Any more questions, anyone? Okay, so that brings us to the end of this session. Aaron, if you want to take over, I think we have a break now for 20 minutes.
Actually, sorry, there's one last talk. Alex Le Tiec is going to speak about the tidal love numbers of spinning black holes. Alex, are you there?
Yeah, apologies, Alex.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Loud and clear. And it's all yours, Alex. Apologies.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk about some very recent work that was done in collaboration with Marc Casals and Edgardo Franzin, which is potentially unfinished. I'll leave it to, I guess, everybody to decide. So arguably, one could say that the question of the tidal deformability of a self-gravitating body is of fundamental interest in gravitational physics. And the question that I'm going to address here is whether a spinning Kerr black hole can be tidally deformed by a tidal field, in particular by the tidal field of a small orbiting companion in an Emery system. And to motivate this question, I'm going to start with the much simpler Newtonian theory of love numbers, which is very well understood. So imagine that you have, in the simplest possible cases, a non-spinning, spherically symmetric Newtonian body of mass m and size r, which generates a Newtonian potential m over little r, where this is the distance to the center of mass. And now imagine that this Newtonian body is tidally deformed by, for instance, a quadrupolar tidal field that derives from some external Newtonian potential. And you're going to evaluate this tidal field at the center of mass of the body. So it's going to add a term to the Newtonian potential that's going to grow quadratically in the distance to the center of mass. And because of this external tidal perturbation, the body is going to respond, deform, and develop an induced mass quadrupole moment q, which in the Newtonian potential will decay as 1 over r cubed. And if the tidal field is weak enough and slowly varying, then the quadrupole is going to be just proportional to the tidal field, to the perturbing tidal field. And the coefficient of proportionality here, lambda 2, is the quadrupolar tidal deformability, which you can easily show scales as the 5th power of the radius of the unperturbed star, where this number in red here, K2, is a so-called quadrupolar tidal love number of the body. It's dimensionless and it encodes information about the internal structure of the body. So if I substitute this formula here, I factor out the quadrupolar tidal field, I get this expression, which can be generalized very easily to a generic multipolar order L, gives me this expression. I can expand the symmetric trace-free combination here involving the tidal fields over spherical harmonics. I get this expression, and this is a sum of the modes where you can really identify in a very clear manner here the growing tidal perturbation as the first term, and this small correction decaying term that decays like r to the minus L minus 1 due to the linear response of the body to that tidal perturbation. And the linear response involves those dimensionless tidal love numbers k. Okay. So this is a Newtonian gravity, and we're going to want to go to general relativity. So we're not going to talk about the Newtonian potential in what comes next. Instead, we're going to focus on the Weyl scale psi 0. And even in the Newtonian limit, you can compute that quantity psi 0 and relate it to this Newtonian potential. And this is what you get. It's essentially the same formula, except you've lost an overall power of 1 over r squared, because this is a curvature quantity. And you're now expanding over spin 2 spherical harmonics instead of spin 0 spherical harmonics. But you see that this is the same overall factor. And I would like you, please, if possible, to remember this formula, I mean, the general structure, because it's going to be really important for the rest of the talk. The key point here is that the psi 0 has a growing tidal perturbation that goes like r to the L minus 2, and a decaying linear response of the body that decays like r to the minus L minus 3. With those constants here, which are the tidal love numbers, which encode information about the body's internal structure, such as composition or equation of state. So this has been generalized to general relativity because it's really interesting for binary neutron stars in spiral, and LIGO and Virgo have already set bounds on tidal deformability of neutron stars. So let me just scheme the relativistic theory of love numbers and the particular definition we use for love numbers of a compact object. So as you go from Newtonian gravity to general relativity, the compact object is going to be now embedded in a tidal environment, which will be characterized by 2 sets of multiple moments. Sorry, not multiple, tidal moments, which are called of electric type E and magnetic type B, which are essentially symmetric trace-free combinations of covariant derivatives of the Weyl tensor evaluated in the local asymptotic rest frame of the compact body. And by analogy to what we saw in Newtonian gravity, if you put your compact object in such a tidal environment, you're going to have a metric, which would be, okay, a background metric of the unperturbed compact object plus a linear metric perturbation H, which can be combined, written as a sum of a tidal contribution, which grows, and a linear response, which decays. And as long as you've performed a unique and unambiguous split, physically meaningful split of the response, you can focus on if you've performed the split of the metric perturbation this way, you can focus on the response and compute out of it the multiple moments, the Gerock-Hansen multiple moments of a asymptotically flat stationary vacuum spacetime, M and S, mass type and current type multiple moments, which will be basically the values in the background, so in our case, a Kerr black hole, plus linear perturbations associated with the response contribution to the metric perturbation due to the fact that you've tidally perturbed your compact object. And that allows us to define 4 coordinate independent families of tidal deformability parameters that couple mass and current multiple moments to electric and magnetic tidal fields, working at the level of the spherical harmonic mode here. And they all scale like, the 2L plus 1 power of the radius of that body in the non-spinning limit without perturbation. And so we rescale them this way to define 4 families of dimensionless tidal Love numbers. So all this has been quite useful for neutron stars, but here we're really interested in black holes. And for black holes, something very special and strange occurs. It seems like black holes have 0 Love numbers. More precisely, quite a lot of people have used very different methods, completely independent method over the years to show that the Love numbers of a non-spinning black hole are 0. Most of the proof involved a weak tidal field, but there was even one proof that was valid for an arbitrarily strong tidal perturbation as long as it's axis symmetric. And this has been generalized to slowly spinning Kerr black holes, perturbatively in the spin parameter by Landry and Poisson to linear order and spin for a weak quadrupolar tidal field, and by Pani and collaborators to quadratic order and spin for a weak quadrupolar axisymmetric tidal perturbation. So given those results, I mean, it's quite natural to ask, is it true that black holes have 0 Love numbers in general for generic spinning black holes that can have a large spin in a generic tidal environment? So this is the question we want to address here. And we address it in the framework of black hole perturbation theory. So we're going to consider, again, a weak tidal perturbation, slowly varying. And the idea is that we're going to put our Kerr black hole of mass S and spin S in this generic tidal environment, use this tidal environment as a boundary condition for the Teukolsky equation for the Weyl scale up psi 0, solve for the static modes, and use the metric reconstruction procedure that was explained by Stephen and Peter in the previous talk to get a reconstructed metric perturbation in the ingoing radiation gauge, out of which we're going to extract the linear response part, out of which we're going to compute the Gerock-Hansen multiple moments, out of which we're going to get the tidal deformability parameters or dimensionless Love numbers. So here is what happens at the level of the perturbed Weyl scalar. So recall that in the Newtonian limit, we've shown that each mode is proportional to the spherical harmonic modes of the electric type tidal moments. And then we have this growing solution that goes like R to the L-2, which is unambiguously associated with the external perturbing tidal field. And this decaying solution, which is unambiguously associated with the linear response of the Newtonian body, with here Love numbers which can depend on M if the Newtonian body is spinning. It's very easily to generalize the Newtonian theory to a spinning background. Now, in the Kerr case, each mode is going to asymptotically be characterized by the tidal environment here, electric type and magnetic type tidal fields. You still expand over spin to spherical harmonics, and this function R here has to be a solution of the static radial Teukolsky equation that asymptotes when R is very large to this Newtonian solution. So you can in fact solve analytically for it. You ask for smoothness of the solution at the horizon, you get a unique solution. And the point is to extract from this unique solution what you want to call a tidal field contribution here, and what you want to call a linear response contribution, which will encode essentially the love numbers of the Kerr black holes. So this is the kind of split we want to perform. And the dots here denote relativistic corrections to the Newtonian result. So until fairly recently, we essentially were all convinced, Mark, Edgardo, and I, that we had done this and end of the story. And so we had the good idea to send an email to Eric, who knows everything about that topic, and that triggered a very interesting email exchange. And so I'd like to basically here try to summarize different takes on this issue. It's quite subtle, in fact, to do this split between tidal and linear response. One way you can do it is say, okay, I have a tidal solution, I have a linear response solution. L here is this multipolar index, and it's an integral larger than 2. And I'm quite annoyed because I realize that the growing solution, this one, is not uniquely defined, because if I add a multiple of a decaying solution to a growing solution, it's still going to be a growing solution. So in principle, it still qualifies as a tidal field contribution to the full solution. So how do you specify your solution uniquely? Well, one way to do it is to say, I want my tidal solution to be smooth everywhere. And in particular, I want it to be smooth on the even horizon of my Kerr black hole. And if you require this, you can very easily show that since the full solution is smooth, the entire solution is in fact going to be associated with the tidal field. And so you'll conclude that there is no linear response and the love numbers will be 0 for all multiple orders independently on spin in general. So love numbers of a Kerr black hole would be 0 if you do this. Instead, you can say, well, in Newtonian gravity, I know that this growing solution, it's exactly R to the L-2 is the tidal contribution. The decaying solution here is the response. So I want to do the most natural extension of this physical interpretation to general relativity. So what you do is you look for the two linearly independent solutions of the radial Teukolsky equation, which carry the pure asymptotically growing behavior and decaying behavior after having performed some analytic continuation of the multiple index, because this analytic continuation allows you to uniquely and unambiguously identify what is the purely growing and purely decaying solution in the full solution. And since the full solution has to be smooth, there's a unique value of the coefficient such that this decomposition is going to be equal to the full solution. And you find that those coefficients are non-zero. So that's what Mark and I think. And in fact, Edgardo has mixed feelings. So as you can see, not everybody agrees. So please bear in mind that everything I'm going to say from now on is based on the use of analytic continuation to identify the tidal and linear response contributions. So if you do that, if you use analytic continuation, you get this split for the full solution into tidal and response with those numbers here, which you can compute. They're given by this very compact formula, which, as you can see, are purely imaginary numbers and involve the product of the azimuthal number with this gamma here, which is directly proportional to the spin of the black hole. And so there's one conclusion you can immediately draw. First, if the black hole has no spin, Schwarzschild background, gamma is 0, those numbers vanish, the response goes away, the full solution is completely associated with the tidal perturbation. So you've given a 6th proof that the love numbers of Schwarzschild black holes are 0. Another important point is that if you now take a Kerr black hole, but you put it in an axisymmetric tidal environment, m is equal to 0, the numbers vanish once again. And so once again, the love numbers will be 0 for a generic axisymmetric perturbation of a generic Kerr black hole. So this generalizes the results by Pani and collaborators. But you see that if the product m gamma is non-zero, those numbers are non-zero, and so you expect to have non-zero love numbers. So how do you get there? Well, as we said, now that we have the solution for psi0, and in particular the linear response contribution to it, we can use the metric reconstruction procedure to get the linear response contribution to the metric perturbation and get to the Guéroc-Hansen multiple moments and therefore to the tidal love numbers. So I'm just going to show the result here. So we did this explicitly. We did the calculation to linear order in the spin of the black hole because it's easier. And we found non-zero mass and current quadrupole moments. As you see, the perturbation in the mass quadrupole is proportional to the electric tidal field. The perturbation in the current quadrupole is proportional to the magnetic tidal field. And you get the scaling expected, namely proportional to spin, proportional to the fifth power of the typical radius of the Kerr black hole for a small spin, and a numerical prefactor. And so the associated dimensionless tidal love numbers are given here. Two vanish, two families, those that correspond to parity mixing, and the other ones don't vanish, and they're given by this very simple formula. If you take a Kerr black hole of spin 0.1, this tells you that the non-vanishing love numbers are of order 0.2%. So although black holes do deform like any other self-gravitating body, they are in fact very stiff because this value is typically much smaller than those for neutron stars in similar cases. Okay. I think I would like to leave time for questions. So I'm going to essentially skip the issue of going from love numbers to love tensors, but I'm just going to say for a spinning background, in fact, you need to generalize the notion of love number to a notion of love tensor. That love tensor will appear in some effective action that will be used to derive the phasing of the wave in a binary system. So it's a really important quantity, this tidal love tensor. We've computed it explicitly, it's here. And I want to really focus on observability. So last year, Pani and Maseli made a really nice observation. They said, well, imagine that you take a stellar mass compact object of mass mu, inspiraling into a supermassive compact object of mass capital M, which has a non-zero quadrupolar love number, irrespective of the nature of the central compact object. Then you can show that by doing essentially a Newtonian order of magnitude estimate, that the tidal field of the small body is going to create a tidal deformation here of the big body, which is a small effect, but a cumulative effect in such a way that over an n spiral, the phase contribution due to this tidal deformability will be of order basically 100 for a mass ratio of 10 to the minus 7 if the quadrupole is of the order 2 10 to the minus 3 in the case of a Kerr black hole of spin point minus 1. So the two important things to say here. One is a cumulative effect that goes at 1 over the mass ratio, just like the first order dissipative cell force. And two, in the case of an MRI with a slowly spinning Kerr black hole, it looks like this effect can easily be seen by LISA, because even for a mass ratio of 10 to the minus 5, it would have an order 1 effect. So the claim I'd like to make is that LISA, thanks to observations of MRI waveforms, will be able to test the tidal deformability of spinning black holes. And so I'd like to finish with a summary. So given the use of analytic continuation, the love numbers of Kerr black holes do not vanish in general. We computed in closed form the leading quadrupolar love numbers to linear order in the black hole spin. Kerr black holes deform like any other self-gravitating body despite being particularly stiff. The black hole tidal deformability contribution to the gravitational wave phase of MRIs will be detectable by LISA, and this provides a new test, a new black hole test of the Kerr-like nature of the massive black hole, the massive compact object at the center of galaxies. Thank you for your attention. And if there are any questions, I hope there will be questions, but mostly I'd like also to say we would like, if possible, to address this issue of analytic continuation in the discussion session this afternoon, led by Justin, if that's possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, very much. Some great news there about you and Mark. We have a huge amount of questions, but no time at all, I'm afraid. So I suggest we do take the breakaway session in the afternoon, if that makes sense. Is that all right?
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alex. Great talk. And it's over. Back to you, Alan.
Thanks very much. Hopefully we can definitely carve out dedicated time to discuss this. We're going to have a break now. We'll come back at the hour, 9 o'clock Central Time. Let me also say that I'd like to attempt to take a sort of group photo at the next break. All that will involve is I'll ask everyone who's comfortable.
Sì, che eravamo rimasti domani mattina?
Everyone who's comfortable doing so to turn on
Sì, ci
their...
sono, ok. Ci sentiamo domani, ma massimo, cioè, proprio nel caso dovesse esserci qualche...
Andrea, sorry, I'm muting you. I'm going to ask everyone who is comfortable to turn on their camera, and I'll just skim through a gallery view. It'll take all of 30 seconds, and then I'll form that into some kind of group photo for Capra 23. So I'm just letting you know now in case you need to maybe put on clothes before the next break at 10:40. So once again, we'll come back at the hour at 9 for another string of talks dedicated now to scattering. I hope everyone stays on this call. Don't leave it. Otherwise, I'll just have to readmit you, and I'll talk to you all again in 15 minutes. All right, we'll get started in just a little bit. Riccardo, you're going to be up first. I've made you co-host. You should be able to screen share.
Aaron, this is Riccardo. Can you see my slide?
Hey, Riccardo, I can see your slides. I can hear you. You're not full screened if that's what your intention is, but your slides are very clear.
I'm not full screen. Good that you told me, because I can fix this. Just a second. How do I fix it? Like this. Is it full screen now?
Actually, the other view is a little better because we weren't losing the very bottom of your slide. What you had before was really good. It just, you still have the thumbnails.
Okay.
If you care. It was good.
What about now?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay.
You're going to need to minimize your Zoom group chat though. So if you can close that or move it, it's sort of blocking your slides.
How do I do that?
I'm not sure.
Just minimize it before you go into full screen on the slideshow.
So in your Zoom meeting, minimize the chat window.
Minimize the chat window. Ah, sorry, the chat window was on the top. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
Sure. That's not. Okay, if I share it now, it should be. Are you seeing? Okay, if I. Cool.
We're seeing you move the mouse around, but we can see your desktop in the background around the edges of your slides.
Okay, just a second. I think I know how to fix this. Is it okay now?
That's great. That's really good. Okay, it's 1 past, so it's time to get started. Welcome back, everyone, to the second half of today. The first speaker for this session will be Riccardo Sturani of the International Institute of Physics. Take it away. Oh, by the way, once again, 60 plus 4 minute talks. So I will flash on my screen and hold up my fingers for 5 and 2 minutes till the end of 16 minutes, and then you'll go into your question time. So go for it, Riccardo.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me here. Thanks to the organizer for having the meeting despite the problem that all the world is having. So my work is not really within this community, but I'd like to present to the radiation reaction community, but I would like to present it anyway, because I think it might be of interest, at least to some of you. It's basically about computing the logarithmic part of the energy function, the leading logarithmic part at all orders within post-Newtonian computation. So since all what I'm saying, it might be off topic for most of you, I prepared the marketing slide basically the first line here, I hope you see my pointer, is the result. So if you, I mean, usually one of the problems when communicating between the PN and Salesforce community is to have the same, computing the same thing. So one has to go to gauge invariant variables to be sure that we're talking about the same thing. And energy of circular orbit is the queen of these gauge invariant variables that it's straightforward to compare. So if you consider just the minus 1/2 symmetric mass ratio times x is the post-Newtonian parameter, you can think of it about as v squared. So this is the standard Newtonian result. What we computed in this paper, actually in the paper that was flashed in the first slide, we did more things, but I just want to focus on this specific result. So we compute the all order leading log. You see here there is log of x and x to some power. So this x to some power also bears logs. And this beta is a coefficient. I will define it later, but it's just a number. And so we have the exact formula for all the leading logs at all order at leading order in the symmetric mass ratio. So this is the marketing I want to make to induce you to keep listening to this talk until the end. So we have computed this within the post-Newtonian approximation, which is a perturbative approach, as all of you know. So you might wonder, how do we get a non-perturbative result from a perturbative approach? And this is basically the subject of my talk. So where these logs come from in the post-Newtonian approach? In the post-Newtonian approach, the log stems arise from tail processes. I mean, this is old stuff, I mean, more than 30 years old stuff. And they start at 4 pn, so x to the 4 with respect to the Newtonian energy. And they are due basically to the fact that if you collapse the binary, you see there is this double line represents the binary system. If you collapse the binary to one point basically, but with a tick point with size, and you allow some in field theory would be called a self-energy process, so emission and reabsorption or radiation, and you allow this emission and self-absorption radiation to scatter over the static field generated by the binary itself, then you obtain an effective Lagrangian contribution. So again, this is the standard Newtonian kinetic term. Then you obtain an effective Lagrangian contribution, which is not instantaneous, but depends on the history of the source. And this you can understand it because the radiation which is emitted and which is reabsorbed is not reabsorbed. The radiation that is absorbed sometimes was not emitted just at retarded time, but it could have been emitted any time inside the light column because of this scattering. What is nice, and again this is ultra standard result, is that this non-local but causal term in the Lagrangian becomes instantaneous when you restrict to circular orbit, and this is the famous coefficient, the leading log coefficient correction to the energy of circular orbit. So you can systematize this. Basically, these self-energy diagrams, you can realize that if you have one mass insertion, two mass insertions, so the scattering over self-energy, the scattering of the self-energy square, and so on, they systematize as a GM omega corrections to the self-energy term. And to end up the introductory slide, basically, you can consider all orders of these self-energy diagrams, and if you consider the real part, they will give you corrections to the conservative dynamics. If you consider the imaginary part, it will give you information about the emitted flux, just the same diagram. And the same diagram, so this is the leading order, that is 0 in the conservative part, and gives you the quadruple formula in the dissipative part. This is the tail correction, so it's a GM omega correction, so it's a 4 pn correction. That gives you the tail correction to the conservative physics in the conservative part and gives you the tail correction to the flux in the dissipative part. This is tail of tail, which happens to have no logarithm at all. Basically, when you move to one order up, you gain one dot, you gain one derivative of time, and when you have an odd number of derivative of times overall of the two quadruple, you can integrate by part and get rid of the log, at least of the leading log. So the tail square has no log in the conservative part, but it has logs in the dissipative part, and so on. But let's focus on the conservative part. The conservative part, basically you have a tail, you skip 2 order of tails, and then you get x cube correction with respect to the leading tail. And so you get the tail square correction, which is the next leading log with respect to the tail. So tail to the 1, we have leading log. Tail to the cube, we have the leading log square. Tail to the 5th, we have the leading log cube, and so on. The tail square, the tail to even power, tail square, tail to the 4, tail to the 6, they do not give leading log corrections. So these are all corrections to the self-energies that contributes to the tails. You might wonder, well, instead of scattering off the static field, the radiated gravitational mode, gravitational radiation could be scattered off the static field sourced by the angular momentum, or could scatter off another gravitational wave, so something sourced by the quadrupole. Well, if that happens, it doesn't give contribution to the leading logs. So the leading logs really comes from the scattering of the static curvature sourced by the total mass of the binary. So this is the structure of the leading logs. They go as eta symmetric mass ratio square, which is first order self-force, because Newtonian is leading order in eta. This is my convention. And they scale as every 2 ordering tails, we get a new leading log to the n. And they are correction parameterized by x to the 4, x to the 7, x to the 10, and so on. So you may wonder, well, this is a perturbative approach. So if you want to have all orders, you have to compute an infinite number of diagrams. This is the naive expectation, but it's not like this, because the leading logs are basically just a resummation of the first term. And this is what I'm going to tell you. And if you don't trust that what we did is correct, well, we have a highly, highly, highly non-trivial check, is that we have all these non-perturbative results, we can expand it. And it beautifully and remarkably matches the 22pn expanded result by Chris et al. About the first order self-force log correction to the energy of circular orbit. So just resumming this leading log, we can get all orders in a way I will tell you in a second. And we are sure that he was correct because the result matches up to what has been computed in self-force, the log part. Of course, in self-force up to 22pn, we have all the self-force, thanks to this paper. If we focus on the logs, leading logs, then our computation to all order exactly reproduces this 22pn, and of course extended it. Okay, this was the marketing. I wanted to tell you what we have computed and why. Of course, it might have not a overwhelming phenomenological impact, but it might be interesting from the theoretical point of view, this match between post-Newtonian to all order and self-force results. So in the remaining 5 minutes, I will tell you some of the details. So in post-Newtonian, we have to do this kind of computation. We have to split the problem into a near zone and to a far zone. So in the near zone, the 2 sources are resolved and are at distance r. In the far zone, the 2 sources are not resolved, it's just one big blob, and endowed with multiples. So these are point-like sources at distance r, and this is the blob with multiples. We work in the fatty field theory formalism pioneered by Goldberger and Rostein. It's now more than 15 years ago, almost 15 years ago. So the near zone is basically looking at the sources at distance r. In the far zone, we look at the source of the distance, which is of the order of the wavelength, which is r over v, so it's larger. So just to summarize, in the near zone, we have the coupling of gravity to point particles, so we have the standard word line action. And in the far zone, we have the coupling to multiples, so energy, angular momentum, quadrupole, octupole, and so on. The bulk action of gravity, of course, is the same in the near and the far zone, which is GR plus gauge fixing. So the type of graphs, Feynman graphs we're considering for the near zone are kind of 2 separated particles exchanging as many gravitational modes as you wish. Of course, more gravitational modes means higher PN order. In the far zone, you have a double line. The double line represents the 2 sources collapse to one blob, exchanging these kind of self-energy diagrams. And the more insertion you make, the more you go up in GM omega, which is the same as V cube, whereas the expansion parameter in the near zone is V square. So one can demonstrate that actually the full conservative physics is given by the sum of the near and far zone contribution. It's not given fully by the near, it's not given fully by the far, but it's given by the two, and there is no double counting. So it's really the sum, there's no overlapping between the two. So the near zone is basically, okay, let me skim, let's go to this line. Suppose you want to compute the exchange of gravitational mode that, here there is the self-energy of particle 2 interacting with particle 1. So in the near zone, one makes, for computational reason, a drastic approximation. So the propagator, the quadridimensional propagator of the gravitational mode is split into space and time. As you see, 1 over k squared becomes 1 plus k0 squared over k to the 4, k0 to the 4th, k to the 4th, and so on. This splitting, of course, is not supposed to work when k0 is of the order of k. So when this gravitational mode can actually be a radiative graviton. So in this regime, if you compute in the near zone, this diagram, we observe an infrared divergence. So infrared divergence in your theory are very bad. It means that you don't understand the theory at large distance when gravity is weak. So this is very bad, but it's kind of intrinsic in this expansion of the propagator. This expansion of the propagator is supposed to work only when omega is much smaller than k. The modulus of k can work. So these infrared divergences are there, they are expected, and the way they are cured is by adding the far zone contribution, which was the self-energy diagram, the leading order self-energy diagram I told you before. And actually, we checked in a paper last year explicitly that this cancellation happens. So there is some divergences. We heal the divergences with the dimensional regularization. This introduced a mu, basically because the Newton constant in a higher dimension, in different dimension different than 3 plus 1 has different dimension than standard space-time. So this mu takes care of this. And so one has the divergence from the far zone computation, the divergence from the near zone computation. The two exactly cancel. It doesn't matter which regulator you use, provided you use the same regulator in the near and far zone. And then you get the logarithmic contribution, and you get the mu cancel between the near and the far zone. Mu is just a regulator that cancels if you consider the full theory. But one important message, one important lesson that we learned is that actually it was known before, but we actually checked it explicitly, that to get the coefficient of the logarithmic in the energy, you can just assume the cancellation and just get it from the far zone computation without bothering to compute also the near part. And so what happens here is that, since we can focus on the far zone alone, let's suppose that we don't know the near. If you don't know the near zone computation, so you don't know that the divergence will be eventually regularized, and I will finish in 2 minutes, you can say, okay, the divergence in the far zone is ultraviolet, is infrared in the near zone, ultraviolet in the far zone. What you do, okay, we drop the divergence, or in future term, we absorb it with the local counterterm. We impose that mu dependence drops out, and this introduces a mu dependence in the parameter, like the mass. If you consider that also the quadrupole as the mu dependence, this was computed, sorry, I forgot to put in the reference. The reference was computed in 2009 by Goldberger and Ross. You plug in this renormalization group equation, which is the equation stating that your result must be independent of mu, irrespectively of the cancellation that you might not know how it happens in the near zone. If you don't know the near zone, you just impose, knowing only the far zone, that the cancellation must happen somehow, and then you can solve the full dependence on the mass, for instance, on mu. You can do it also from the angular momentum. And then you get the dependence of the mass at any scale mu on the quadruple and the angular momentum on the quadruple. The quadruple dependence on mu was known. This is the data that I wrote in the first slide. It was known since 2009. And so you can short circuit all the information and get the energy of circular orbit. Not quite, because as you see, the energy of the circular orbit would depend on these derivatives, this n plus 2 derivative of q, which depends on both r and v. Unless you relate r and v, you cannot get the energy of circular orbit. That you can do by adding this other piece of information. So, oops, sorry. The relationship between the variation of energy, the differential of the energy, the differential of angular momentum is just given by omega, the orbital angular derivative. And so you get how gm over r is shifted by this tail term, and then you get the formula for the energy and angular momentum on circular orbit, which is kg invariant. You see, this is post-Newtonian expanded, and the resummation is the formula that I gave in the first slide. And this is all I wanted to say. I hope I interested you enough so you stayed until the end of this talk, and I'm open to questions.
Great, thank you very much, Riccardo. We do have time for questions. Chris, go for it.
Riccardo, thanks for the talk. So this might be a dumb question and is borderline numerology, but I can't help but notice that you are aware of MST and what we use in Cellforce a lot. It's an analytic expansion of the Teukolsky equation. But one of the quantities that comes up in MST is this thing nu, which we use a lot. And the low frequency expansion of this quantity, the first correction is exactly beta. The coefficient in a low frequency expansion is exactly beta.
Sorry, what is beta?
The value you get here, beta L.
Okay. Okay, my beta, okay.
Yeah, so one can't help but feel that if you look at the low frequency Cellforce expansion, you should also be able to kind of reproduce or try and confirm your results. This
So
I mean very big.
You mean a tall order?
Yeah, well, potentially. If you did a lot of work, potentially.
So, Chris, is there any, I don't have a good physical understanding of the angular momentum parameter in the MST formalism. It seems like it's just a technical matching parameter. Is there a physical understanding that would indicate why it might be connected to this self-energy correction?
Physical? Yeah, I'd struggle.
Well,
this might...
go ahead, and then comment.
No, please comment.
The angular momentum is just a trick that we need to shrink to collapse our result to circular orbits. I mean, if we don't get the relationship for angular momentum and we cannot connect angular momentum to energy, then we have, in a generic orbit with R and V. And then if we cannot connect, basically, if we cannot know the correction to the R to V due to the tail, then we cannot collapse the energy formula to circular orbit. I mean, we have the energy for generic orbit, but we want to collapse to circular orbit to make a connection to a gauge environment.
This is just an unfortunate, I think, terminology issue. I don't even know if I was correct in using the word angular momentum parameter, but basically when one is solving the wave equations in Kerr through the current favored method, there's an eigenvalue problem that must be solved for some complex parameter. And Chris is just pointing out that complex parameter has some known analytic expansions which match yours, but I don't know of any angular momentum. I don't know of any physical understanding of this parameter, this eigenvalue. Adrian, you are muted if you're talking. Adrian?
You're still muted.
Thank you. Sorry, I thought I'd unmuted the keyboard. So the one physical understanding we have through normalized angular momentum is in terms of the monodromy about infinity. And you could see that actually, I'm not sure it was this paper with Chris or one of the later ones where we actually look in terms of the asymptotic expansion of our up solution around infinity. And you can actually see that rather than the naive asymptotic behavior, nu appears in the exponent of r at infinity. So you could imagine that would relate to infrared properties. I don't know if you have anything to, is that, Chris, I don't know if you remember that?
Yeah, I do. And I think the important thing we found, Adrian, was that the nu was resumming all of the log terms in that asymptotic series.
Yep.
So it is directly related to logs, for sure. Anyway, that's just...
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Adrian, for pointing that out. So perhaps there's something here, and perhaps, as Chris said, it may just be numerology, but Riccardo, maybe we can exchange some archive links on the Slack channel Unfortunately, I think we're a minute over. So thanks once again, Riccardo, for that interesting talk. Hopefully there are some cool connections we can all find. And it's a very interesting result. Next up is going to be Christopher Munna. Sorry if I mispronounced your last name, Christopher. Can you?
It's Munna, but it's fine.
Munna. Okay. Well, take it away.
Great. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay. All right, is this coming through full screen?
Yes, that's looking good.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so as you said, I'm Chris Munna, and I do a lot of work analytically post-Newtonian expanding black hole perturbation theory quantities to high order. And I have a focus right now on eccentric orbits about a Schwarzschild background. And so let's talk about that. This is actually going to be somewhat of an extension of my talk from last Capra. And so some of the background I'm going to go through pretty quickly, because otherwise I'm not going to be able to finish. So we're going to look at both black hole perturbation theory and post-Newtonian theory. And we've seen plots kind of describing the regimes of validity of those two. And so most of the time you see that in the previous versions, we've kind of cut off black hole perturbation theory at this region here and not just put it into the widely separated orbits regime. However, there are certain situations, certain calculations where black hole perturbation theory can be applied to high order, and in particular when doing MST type calculations. And so in those cases, we can take a look at BHPT and PN together and move first or potentially second order black hole perturbation theory solutions into the post-Newtonian regime and expand the Emery motion to high PN order. And if you go to high order enough, there's the potential that we can still get convergence close into the merger. There are additional benefits to this kind of approach. It does reveal information. Each theory kind of informs the other in ways that are more difficult to achieve through each theory independently. Then we can use these kinds of expansions to inform effective one-body models, which have been overwhelmingly effective in LIGO, inspirals, and so on. And then we can apply factorization and resummation to improve the convergence even further. And so in this talk, I'm going to be taking, the case of eccentric orbits on a Schwarzschild background, and I'm going to be trying to generate high order expansions for the fluxes and conservative sector quantity known as the generalized redshift invariant. So first, let's look in the dissipative sector and see how things play out there. So as I'm sure many are familiar with, work with the RWZ formalism, which in the frequency domain reduces to this infinite set of ODEs. The homogeneous counterpart to these ODEs can be solved using the MST method to get the pair of homogeneous solutions x up and x in, or x plus and x minus. Once you have the homogeneous solutions, you can get the full inhomogeneous solution using extended homogeneous solutions, where you need these C coefficients using this complicated integral involving the homogeneous solutions at the location of the particle, some source terms, the Wronskian, and the radial period. And then you can get the first order metric perturbations from the inhomogeneous solution. So in a little more detail, you can see that the homogeneous MST function, the odd parity sector for x up, it has this complicated form. It involves a renormalized angular momentum, as we were just talking about, and a confluent hypergeometric function and things like that. The particular form of this isn't important. What's most important is that each part of this expression contains these parameters z and epsilon, which are both related to 1 over c, which means you can p and expand this solution very easily by just collecting powers of eta. And then the horizon side solution, homogeneous solution, has a similar form. And so basically you expand nu, and then you expand the series coefficients, and then you expand everything else. You work with specific L and general M and N, following the paper from Kavanagh, Ottawell, and Wardell, and you can get very high order expansions for the homogeneous solutions that start to look somewhat like this, involving Euler gamma and pi and logarithms and things like that. Once you have the odd parity MST solution, it's trivial to get the even parity using the Detweiler-Chandra-Sekar transformation, so that's fun. Then moving to the inhomogeneous problem is a large increase in difficulty. In particular, we require the homogeneous solutions evaluated at the location of the smaller body, which means we need post-Newtonian expansions of geodesic motion on Schwarzschild. And so following the prescription laid out in Hopper, Kavanagh, and Ottawell, we can put this in the Darwin parameterization in terms of these parameters here. And note that P, the semilattice rectum, or 1 over P rather, is a 1pn quantity. So a post-Newtonian expansion is equivalent to an expansion just in 1 over P. At each order in 1 over P, so we're going to convert all our expansions from eta to 1 over P. And at each order in 1 over P, we're going to expand in E, the eccentricity, and that's just to make the expressions manageable and be able to get output from the integrals. So working in this way, all the coordinates and frequencies are very easy to expand. And then once you have everything in 1 over P and E expansion form, you find that the source integral, the normalization constants, C plus or minus, become straightforward but extremely large sums of complex exponentials. This represents the bottleneck, particularly in the dissipative sector calculations. However, there are many simplifications available over what would be the most naive or straightforward implementation of this procedure. In particular, you can find Z-independent factors, very complicated factors that depend only on epsilon, and these can be canceled from the start if you notice that they will ultimately be canceled through division by the Wronskian. Similarly, we can do factorizations, which is pulling Z-independent factors out and then multiplying them back in at the end, and that saves quite a bit of time as well. And then naturally, a lot of speed up just arises from being careful with your function choices in Mathematica. One perk about the dissipative sector is that larger L start at higher P in order and larger N start at higher order in eccentricity, which means that only a finite number of modes are required. And so an example of what that looks like, I've defined this kind of Pn adjusted frequency to avoid evaluating the expansion of the frequency until later. That also saves a bit of time in the expansion process. And so it starts to look a little bit like this. So I went in and did that for a whole bunch of normalization constants in order to get the fluxes. And so here's a little idea of how long and difficult that is, the computational expense and kind of the limits of this procedure, or at least with my present code. And so L equals 2 is the most complicated in both the plus and minus. Takes about 7 days to get to 19p in an e to the 10th relative order, the even parity version. And the output, when put into a text file, it's about 60 megabytes for the L equals 2, and then it rapidly gets smaller from there. The C minus ones are even bigger, 140 megabytes, thereabouts, to get to 18p and then e to the 10th. And then here, these last two are e to the 20th. And so you can see how those compare. The odd parity counterparts are faster and a little bit smaller as well. Okay. So from there, the energy fluxes, both infinity and the horizon, or the fluxes rather, both infinity and the horizon are very straightforward, given by these formulas here. It's customary to work with, instead of 1 over p, y, which is related to the azimuthal frequency, because that is what has been used in post-Newtonian work, and also because y is gauge invariant. There are certain advantages to retaining results in 1 over p, and so I experiment with convergence, I experiment with both. And so to put this all in context, the state of the art for circular orbits is 22 pn for the fluxes at infinity relative to the leading order there, and 18.5 pn in the horizon fluxes relative to the leading order there. So now a little more context on the eccentric orbit results, or past work. So this is what the expansion looks like. Each L is a function of eccentricity. This first red line is from prior post-Newtonian work. And then from there, most work has mostly been done using black hole perturbation theory. And in particular, there have been 2 projects, one from Forsyth Evans Hopper, and then one from myself and them, doing numeric analytic fitting. And that gives you results to varying orders in E. And I don't really have time to go into all that procedure, but I'll just give you the kind of how the results have progressed over time. So first, Forsyth Evans Hopper produced results using fitting to these orders in eccentricity. And then we kind of went back in and refined those same methods. And we have a paper coming out very soon that details the expansions to these orders. But then for all analytic expansions, you don't have varying orders in eccentricity, you have kind of uniform. And so this is how we get now. So not quite as high orders in eccentricity at low pn order, but you get to much higher pn order. And so I went to 10 pn and e to the 20th, and then redid everything and did 19 pn and e to the 10th for the fluxes at infinity, and then 18 pn and e to the 10th for the fluxes at the horizon. Horizon fluxes are a little bit different. They're suppressed by a factor of 4 pn, which means that this 18 pn is actually 22 pn relative to the leading contribution at infinity. And the structure is a little bit different, but not too much so. So a few comparisons. I haven't had time to go in and make comparisons with the full flux, but I did do something with just a single element mode. So we're looking here at 220. And so I have circular orbit just for comparison to see where the circular orbit breaks down in eccentricity. The standard, this combines the 10pn e to the 20th and 19pn e to the 10th. Log means I took the log of the series, got a new series, and then plug in the numerical values, and then took the exponential of that because that has been used as a resummation method in circular orbit case successfully. And then similar thing with the reciprocal. And so you can see at E of 0.01, the circular orbit breaks down pretty quickly. The log looks great and superior early on, but then they all kind of meet up later on, or at higher p in order. If you increase the eccentricity to 1/10, the circular orbit outside of this strange match at very low p in order breaks down very quickly. And then these all kind of match up and get you to 10 to the minus 6 or so. At E of 1/4, surprisingly, the two resummed versions break down very early, but with the standard combination, we still get decent convergence. Past E of 1/4, I did start to see some trouble. The convergence or the matching was very poor. However, it's important to realize that this is just a single mode flux, and so I'm not able to use eccentricity singular factors, which can improve convergence, and closed forms, which appear in the full fluxes and things like that. So just for fun, looking at a larger value of P, of course, the convergence is going to be better. And see here, it matches better than 10 to the minus 9. And this also allows access to, say, E of 1/2 for the larger value of P. Again, the resummed versions are not very good for reasons unclear. All right, so that was the dissipative sector. Let's look into the conservative sector. So the conservative sector involves the metric perturbations are evaluated at the location of the particle. And so these take forms like this. The problem with these expressions is that the p-n orders don't increase with L, meaning we need all L in order to get valid expansions. Obviously, that's not possible with the methods I've displayed so far because they've relied on specific L calculations. Turns out there is a way forward, and it involves leaving L unevaluated and then expanding in terms of generic L. Unfortunately, the full MST solution is very unwieldy because of the gamma functions. However, Bini et al. And Kavanagh et al. Have used this kind of p-n expansion ansatz, where you assume the homogeneous solutions have these forms here, and then you plug them into the Reggie-Wheeler equation and solve order by order with general Z, epsilon, and L. It turns out that this method gives you the correct expansion to LPN order. This means that you can combine specific L MST solutions up to a particular PN order and then use the general L solutions for all the rest. And so this is what it looks like for X up, just an example there, it's a 2PN. And so these general L expansions are much more expensive, but not terrible. And so I've been working a lot on trying to optimize them and whatnot. And so currently the normalization constant, which is probably the bottleneck step in the calculation, requires about 7 days and 21 gigabytes of memory to reach 8PN and e to the 20th. So possibly the most important, or one of the most important conservative sector quantities to pursue in this manner is the redshift invariant, which is the average of dt d tau over an orbit. It's very interesting because it supplies terms in an effective one-body potential. And so for that, we need the regularized metric at the location of the particle. And so kind of just followed this procedure all the way through, and hoping to get to 8PN and e to the 20th, and then maybe 13 or 15 PN e to the 4th, perhaps something in between like 10 PN and e to the 12th, et cetera. And so this would be a decent improvement over past work to 4 PN and e to the 20th, 9.5 PN e to the 8th, and so on. All right, and so then looking into the future, another interesting conservative sector quantity is the spin precession invariant, which involves the local cell force. It's an order of magnitude more expensive than the redshift invariant. And so here's the current state of the art there, but I like to go in and use these kind of same techniques and hopefully extend that by quite a bit. Also desirable would be the local cell force itself. The quantity is gauge dependent, but I believe there was some discussion yesterday about maybe Chris Kavanagh or others have already gone in and done this to some extent. So I'd be very interested to try that out as well. And then finally, redo all of this with the Teukolsky formalism for a central Kerr black hole. It would obviously be several orders of magnitude more expensive, but there's a reason to believe we can get a lot of good information and potentially, hopefully we'll find some additional resummation techniques that'll improve convergence and find that these expansions are very useful. And so that's about it. So I'll just leave up my conclusion slides. I don't know where my time is, and you're ready for questions.
All right, thank you very much. You do have time for questions. So any questions for Christopher? So far, no questions. Let me perhaps just ask, you know, these are really impressive results, but at the same time, of course, it looks like the convergence with PN order isn't super fast looking at your slides overall. I guess this isn't surprising at high eccentricity. Do you have any thoughts about how far this can be pushed realistically and what kinds of fractional errors you want to be trying for in the long term?
Yeah, so I've just been doing a little bit of toying around or comparing for full fluxes as opposed to just mode fluxes, and then using exact forms and singular factors and whatnot. And so it looks like you can get a little bit higher in eccentricity, but it does start to break down, you know, at fairly mid-level eccentricity. The problem appears to be that the post-Newtonian expansion just weakens in convergence with the higher eccentricity. The coefficients just become quite a bit larger. It's already been shown that you need, in the circular orbit case, that you need very high expansions in order to get good convergence for small p. It's possible that in the eccentric case, the limiting p that we're going to be able to reach is just higher.
Okay. Lots of compliments in the chat, and Justin has a question.
Oh, okay.
Thanks. Yes, very nice talk, Chris. You mentioned in the flux, at least, that some post-Newtonian orders, at some post-Newtonian orders, you can get all orders in eccentricity.
Mm-hmm.
Can you also do that for some PN orders in the redshift?
Yes. Well, so it's not coming straight from the expansion itself. It's coming from knowledge from post-Newtonian theory. So like, for instance, you can get the lowest order flux and then realize that a singular factor of 1 minus e squared to the 7/2 must be pulled out, and then you just get Peters-Matthews back. And so those kinds of things occur at multiple PN orders and for certain log terms and things like that. And that does also occur in the redshift.
Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
All right. If there are no further questions, thanks once again. The next speaker is Andrea Antonelli. Andrea, can you share your screen? And Chris, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah, I'm trying to get to. It won't.
It's okay. I can stop your sharing.
Can you all hear me?
We can, Andrea.
Great.
And we can see your screen.
You can see the screen, full screen.
Full screen looks good. So whenever you're ready.
All right. So actually, let me put the timer on so that I stay on track. Thank you, Aaron, first of all, for organizing this first virtual Capra meeting. I must say it retains the nice atmosphere of the usual Capras. So in this 20 minutes or so, I'm going to describe some work that collaborators and I have been recently working on, and actually recently also published. And this work fits into what nicely Adam yesterday referred to as the scattering revolution, which is a term I really like. If I had to go, can you see? Yeah, now I'm moving. So if I had to describe the content of this talk, and in fact, the content of the paper we published in a one-liner, it would be that we derived the third subleading post-Newtonian spin orbit order dynamics. For those who know the literature, this corresponds to the next to leading PN spin orbit dynamics. but I'll do a favor to myself and to all of you and just refer to it as N3LO throughout and throw in SO, which is the spin orbit part. Now, after calculating this particular term in the post-Newtonian expansion, we also apply to waveform modeling. We improve some waveform models, but I don't really want to go into the applications in this talk. Rather, you may know it's already been mentioned. It's been mentioned in this conference so far that there is this nice construct of the scattering angle, which allows people to calculate dynamics to very high Pn orders. And in fact, we use this construct, which allows people to actually get constraints from the scattering and small mass ratio limits of the compact object binary to synergetically calculate new orders in the post-Newtonian expansion. So in fact, what I consider the goal of my talk is to go through the ingredients that go into this derivation, so you perhaps have a clearer idea of what people meant yesterday when they were mentioning this particular fact. So I mentioned that one needs to consider the scattering limit of the compact object binary. So let me expand a little bit further on that. I want you to consider compact objects scattering off of each other in an unbound orbit. Now, I have a tendency to mention black holes rather than compact objects. So let's say from the very beginning, let's consider two black holes, although the results that I'm going to show apply to compact objects in general. Now, the fact when one considers unbound orbits is that there is no fundamental reasons not to believe the velocities to be arbitrary. It's not like when we have systems in a bound orbit, which in certain schemes get virialized, which tends to bring the velocities down. So it's natural to describe this sort of scattering limit with approximations to the two-body problem, which maintain this sort of arbitrariness in the velocity. Now, the two approximations that we will be using are the post-Minkowskian approximation, PM, and this is an expansion in weak fields, so small g for arbitrary velocities. And of course, we will also consider the small mass ratio approximation, where we have Q, the small mass ratio, which is small. The first question you should immediately have is, Andrea, why do you even care? I mean, we see that LIGO routinely sees systems in bound systems. So we saw that yesterday as well. So they must be the astrophysically relevant ones. So what I would like to argue later on is that this scattering knowledge can in fact be used to improve our analytical understanding of bound systems as well. Another case that I want to mention is that there is a lot of potential for interdisciplinary studies between our community, so the gravitational wave astrophysics community, and the scattering amplitude community, where they are coming from a background of high energy physics. They have massive computational tools, which in the classical limit describe precisely this sort of post-Minkowskian expansions that we are talking about. So there is, again, great potential for interdisciplinarity. Now, if we are talking about scattering, it's very important, as was also mentioned in previous talks in different contexts, to consider gauge invariant quantities. These are reference quantities that allow, of course, cross-cultural studies between different approximations to the two-body problem. And indisputably, one of the most important gauge invariant quantities when one considers scattering systems is the scattering angle, which you can see a sketch of in the left-hand side. It's what you would expect the scattering angle to be, so angle between the incoming and outgoing state. And perhaps what is also important to mention at this point is a particular way of getting to the scattering angle, which is this integral here of the partial derivative of the radial momentum with respect to the angular momentum. When one goes through this integral, one gets a function, the scattering angle function, which is a function of B, which is the covariant impact parameter, and V, the asymptotic relative velocity. So what I would like to mention here is that one of the arguments of the radial momentum is the energy, therefore the Hamiltonian. Now this has some important consequences. First of all, the first consequence, first feature, actually regards the status of the scattering angle as a reference quantity. That's because if we start from a Hamiltonian, which is gauge dependent, if we go through this calculation, what happens is that all of the gauge freedom gets peeled off, and we end up with some function which is gauge independent. Or said differently, the scattering angle encapsulates the local in time conservative dynamics. Let me just say conservative dynamics of the scattering system. Another point that is very important is that this scattering angle can be obtained from a Hamiltonian, because Hamiltonian is in the argument. And this provides a natural link between the scattering angle and the Hamiltonian, which means that we can transfer knowledge from the scattering angle, which comes from unbound orbits, most naturally, put it and repackage it into a Hamiltonian. Once we have a Hamiltonian, no one forbids us from actually using it to improve our knowledge of bound orbits. So in this particular approach, this is how the whole point of how one gets information from the unbound orbits and puts them into a scheme which is usable for bound orbits as well. Now, the point of this slide is to say that the scattering angle is great. It's therefore important to study it in detail. When this was done, it was noticed in a paper by Damour last year, but it was also used by now famous paper by Bini, Damour, Geralicon, where they get almost all of the 5PN dynamics. So it was noticed that this scattering angle has a very simple dependence on the symmetric mass ratio, nu, which I define here. Now this dependence goes as follows. If one rescales the scattering angle by the center of mass energy, which does contain a non-trivial dependence on nu, one gets on the right-hand side an expansion, a PM expansion, because it's an expansion in G, which has a particular form, a particular dependence on the mass ratio. All of these functions, x, depend only on the relative velocity and the spin, not on the mass ratio, which means that up to 2 PM, the dynamics is specified by nu to the 0 results, which means for non-spinning systems, geodesic results. Let that sink in for a little bit. First of all, it's important to notice that, and this is something that perhaps I should mention again, if you fix the scattering angle, you have fixed the dynamics, okay? And nu to the 0 terms are enough to get the 1 PM, the 2 PM dynamics. If one goes to 3 PM, 4 PM, you only see terms that are linear in nu. And this is great as well, because these are terms that in principle are accessible to us and to this community. Let me also mention what comes from the other community, so the scattering angle community. Let me just focus on non-spinning systems, because I'm aware of time as well. Up to 3 PM, the community, the scattering amplitude community has calculated and published so far the 3 PM dynamics. What this means is that there is great potential for us from this community to actually calculate this linear in nu term and get to the 4 PM dynamics. I won't go any more into this because I will let Oliver talk about that next. But let me mention at this stage that we do not yet have scattering data, so we do not have access to this 4 PM dynamics. But what we can do is to further re-expand these particular functions in the velocity. This will mean that we get into a PN expansion, a double PN expansion of the scattering angle. And there, as Chris mentioned before, we definitely do have analytical self-force results. So this is in fact our goal. We want to consider the PN limit of the scattering angle. And when we do so, the 4th PM order, which is, as we saw before, specified by linear in nu results, this 4 PM order contains in the PN expansion the N3LO dynamics. Now, if we consider the non-spinning dynamics, N3LO non-spinning dynamics, this corresponds to 3 PN, which is not really so interesting. It's been known for decades. But even if we don't go into high PN orders, which is what Donato will hopefully talk about later on, we can still exploit this dependence at 4 PM and go into the spinning dynamics, because this particular term, N3LO, SO, sorry, here I should have said spin orbit dynamics, because the N3LO spin orbit dynamics, which contributes to 4.5 PN, is not known. And in particular, it's the term that is not known, which would allow us to complete the dynamics at this order, together with NLO, next to leading order spin cube results from other references. So our goal is to get this particular order and therefore complete our knowledge at 4.5 pn. How do we do that? We start from what is known in the literature. So we get the scattering angle at 3.5 pn order spin orbit. So this looks something like that. Let me go just very quickly through the notation. I only want to mention the spins, spin 1, spin 2. These are canonical aligned spins, which means we consider a spin aligned configuration to begin with. And then we have also other combinations of the spins, which are these A plus and minus, but I'll just give you a rule of thumb. Whenever you see S or A, it means spin in some form or another. Also, what I want to mention here is look at this particular form of the scattering angle. We do have two vectors, so A plus and delta A minus. This is a vector that contracts with this particular coefficients. This is the scattering angle we know. What we want to get is the scattering angle at one order higher, so 4.5 pn. We create a parametrized form of the scattering angle where we add these terms in red at 4 pm, but also high in V terms at 3 pm, which would allow us to completely specify the 4.5 pn dynamics. Also notice that, importantly, I've parameterized the linear in new terms at 3.5 pn, and that's because we want to rederive them. Even if we knew them from before, they are hidden somewhere here. We want to rederive them because this will be a very non-trivial check that our whole construct even works in the first place. So my job and our job at the end, in the remaining 4-5 minutes of this talk, is to fix all of these coefficients. Now this happens to, therefore fixing the scattering angle and therefore the dynamics. This happens to work in 3 steps. In the first step, we simply notice that there are terms, the new terms at 4.5 pn, new to the 0, which can be fixed by geodesic, and in fact, sorry, since this is the spin orbit test spin results, what this means is that we go check a paper by Bini, Giralico, and Vines, 2017, where they give an expression for the test spin scattering angle, which has some, it's complicated looking, but definitely manageable. This is 4 aligned spins. Let me just give a shout out to Wojciech's talk on Friday, I think, where he will discuss the generic case. If one goes through the calculation for the test spin scattering angle, one immediately manages to fix these terms in blue. After this particular step, we are left with terms that only depend in, which are linear in nu. So these are the ones accessible to cell force. But before even considering cell force results, let's do something a little bit more sophisticated than this first step. That is, we constrain the Hamiltonian, sorry, the scattering angle from the Hamiltonian. That is, we introduce a local in time Hamiltonian up to 4.5 pn order, but where we keep the coefficients unspecified at 3.5 and 4.5 pn, so that we can check the results at 3.5 pn and just extend them to 4.5 pn. From this Hamiltonian, and here I'll need to go back for a second, from this Hamiltonian, we can get a scattering angle going through this formula, which allows us to get a scattering angle which depends on these unspecified coefficients at the orders we are interested in. Now, this scattering angle up to this stage, it's not constrained, but we can constrain it by matching it to this particular parametrized form of the scattering angle, which exhibits the mass ratio dependence we are interested in. After doing this matching, we will get that some of the red coefficients of the parametrization of the scattering angle will be fixed by low order up to 2.5 pn in the Hamiltonian, which we have, which we have put in. And this allows us actually to get these terms in blue up to v square of the scattering angle, get some constraints for v to the 4, but unfortunately we won't be able to say anything else for these terms, which still remain in red. So at the end of this step, we will still have 6 unknowns, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2 out of these 2 pairs. Now we have a Hamiltonian, which depends on this on these parameters of the scattering angle, which we want to fix. And here is where the cell force results come in. And this is, just to mention the title of the paper, how we go from cell force results to arbitrary mass ratios. after having constrained the Hamiltonian so far, what we can do is go and check some papers by Barak and Sago, but also importantly, these were really important for us, by Bini and Geralico from July last year. And there one can see how one way, there are others, but one way, just for the sake of presentation, one way to get from the Hamiltonian, which we have, to the redshift and the spin precession invariant. Now, these two, in the small mass ratio limit, must match results which are available in the literature. Now, we need enough constraints from the self-force literature, which means we will have to go, we will have to consider eccentricity in this self-force information, hence the orbit averaging above. But the whole point here is that one can fix all of the remaining coefficients through this second matching, so this third step. So we get all of the coefficients, we get the scattering angle, which means, again, we get the dynamics. Very quickly, the applications. I'm aware of time, by the way, Aaron, don't worry. The applications, we have the dynamics, the scattering angle, we can get a Hamiltonian. But it's also important, for instance, to get into Hamiltonians which exhibit gyrogravito-magnetic ratios. So this GSS star, which are parameterization of the spin, such that the Hamiltonian looks something like that, or at least the first line for the aligned spins. We can do it, say, in a UB-like Hamiltonian, so that our results can easily get into the waveform models used by LIGO calculations. And what's the advantage of this, going into yet another Hamiltonian? Well, given that the Hamiltonians are gauge dependent, the advantage here is that these gyro ratios are written in such a way that they do not depend on the spin. So all of the dependence on the spin in the Hamiltonian is through these particular terms, which means that generalization to generic orbits is quite straightforward. You just need an arrow and a dot. Another thing one can do is calculate circular orbit binding energies, which Riccardo mentioned before in another context, but the whole point is that these are reference quantities, even if, for instance, you want to take your results and compare them to numerical relativity results. And I will just show a plot for these new gyro ratios. And you just need to see that this term in our new terms in orange bring the Hamiltonian towards the right direction, so towards cyan, which is numerical relativity. Take home point, we have fixed the 4.5 N3LO SO term, which allows us to complete our knowledge of 4.5 PN order through this particular dependence of the mass ratio, and making use of both the scattering and small mass ratio limit of the Hamiltonian. Future work, one can go into higher order in the spins. One can go into generic spins, for instance. Here, I'm just using this again for another shout out of Wojciech's talk on Friday, because probably one of the best places to start is to get the test spin scattering angle for generic orbits. One can exploit more self-force information. One can, in fact, forget about the spin sector and push higher order in PNs, in higher PN order. And I hope Donato will talk about that more next. Or one can forget about the PN expansion and consider scattering data. But this is the topic of Oliver's talk. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Andrea. We are basically over time, but let's let Sam ask one question.
Okay, thanks, Aaron, for sneaking me in. Great talk. I had a question about the gauge invariance of the scattering angle. This is naive. I've never thought about this, but I could imagine that initially you have two bodies far separated, going at each other. You could define some kind of impact parameter. You know what you're talking about. Similarly, well after the encounter, they're moving away from each other. You know what you're talking about. But if you want to get a scattering angle, you have to compare those two situations. So you're in the classic problem of comparing two flat space-times separated by a strong field encounter where there'd be radiation, all sorts of things. I would think you'd have super translation ambiguities, etc. So has this been discussed, and what's the status?
I've not discussed that. And in fact, sorry, I don't know the status of this. I've been taking this as a given, sort of. But what you're saying makes sense to me. And in fact, I would be very keen to discuss this further with you later on, Slack or discussion session. if you
Yeah, I
don't
would
mind.
love if we could work it into discussion. Thanks.
Yeah. Or if Justin has some comments.
Yes,
Yeah,
if I may, very quickly, because we're over time. I'm going to offer a very short answer to your question as no. People, at least the people who have been working on this, have not thought a lot about that, and we need to. And let's definitely do that, discuss it this afternoon at the discussion session.
Thank you for the comment, Sam.
Yeah, so great. So we'll work that into the discussion session later. And for now, thank you again, Andrea. Let's have Oliver, if you're able to, start screen sharing. Perfect. And if you're ready, take it away.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Can, yes.
Good. Okay. So hi, everyone. I'm Ollie Long. I'm a PhD student at Southampton, and I'm going to be talking about self-force calculations of the scatter angle in hyperbolic orbits. And this is work I've done with my supervisor, Leo Barak. So first I'll start with motivation. And a lot of these were spoken about just by Andrea, so I'll just go through it quickly. We can get exact post-Teukolsky calculations using self-force data. And if you have the first order self-force, you exactly get the two-body Hamiltonian up to 4 p.m. And if you have the second order self-force, you exactly get it up to 6 p.m. Again, as Andrea said, you can use the scatter data, the self-force data, to compare with the scatter amplitude community. And another motivation is you can use strong field benchmarking. And this works because here we've got the periastron against the impact parameter. And as you can see, even for low energies, the particles can penetrate well below the ISCO. So that will be good to do that. And also for these, you'd need no PN or PM expansions. So first I'll start talking about scatter geodesics and the different parameterizations. The first one, you have energy, which has to be greater than 1, and angular momentum. And to avoid plunge, this angular momentum has to be greater than a critical angular momentum for each given energy. And when this happens, the particle comes in, hits the potential at a certain radius, and then goes back out. So the second parameterization is eccentricity and semilatus rectum. And for this, the eccentricity has to be greater or equal to 1. And again, the semilatus rectum has to be greater than a critical value. And for this parameterization, we can use new parameter chi, which is useful for getting value things along the orbit. And this chi is defined between two values where r goes to infinity. Now, the last parameterization is one that Andrea also brought up, which involves the velocity at infinity and the impact parameter. And as Andrea said, these are useful because they are defined at infinity, so you can compare with other approaches and use them for benchmarking. So now I'll talk about the scatter angle. This scatter angle is defined in the same way as Andrea's. And if we solve this, then this is the form that we get as a function. Yeah, we get this form, and this f here is a complete integral of the third kind. So if we start talking about the self-force correction, you can expand the scatter angle here in terms of the mass ratio eta at constant velocity at infinity and impact parameter. And again, this is useful for comparing to other methods. So when you solve this, this is the form of the equation you get. So we'll just have a look at what it depends on. You have functions that depend on the eccentricity and the semilatus rectum, these a's and b's. And then you have integrals of the temporal part of the conservative self-force and also the azimuthal across the entire orbit. And then you have the same parts of the conservative self-force times by these functions, which are functions of chi across the entire orbit. And these are known, but way too complicated to write and display in this talk. So now move on to the method that we're going to use to get the self-force. we'll use a time domain metric reconstruction in a radiation gauge to directly solve for the Hertz potential, and then use mode sum regularization to get the self-force. The main hurdle of this is the formulation of the jump conditions for the Hertz potential. But once we have these jump conditions, we will implement them using a 1+1 evolution in null Eddington-Finkelstein coordinates. So for the rest of the talk, I will talk about how we formulate these jump conditions for the Hertz potential, then how we implement them and problems we've come across and resolutions. We'll also talk about the evolution of the Teukolsky equation and a problem we found of divergent modes in the results and how we resolve this by transforming to a Reggie-Wheeler-like equation. So earlier we had some nice talks on metric reconstruction, so I will only go through this very briefly, but for the vacuum case, you have the Teukolsky equation which the Weyl scalars satisfy. From these, you can get the Hertz potential via a fourth order operator. And then this Hertz potential obeys the adjoint Teukolsky equation, which is the Teukolsky equation, but with opposite spins. And from this, you get the metric by using a second order operator S dagger, and this gives it up to angular momentum and energy and gauge perturbations. So for the particle case, we have a source Teukolsky equation where the equation is sourced by a delta function, and this gives several solutions for the Hertz potential and the metric. The most general is the full string case, where you have a string singularity that goes from the central black hole through the particle off to radial infinity. And now there is a degree of freedom here, which can be used to get rid of parts of the singularity. So here we have two what are called half string solutions, where the first one, the degree of freedom has been used to get rid of the string singularity from the central black hole to the particle, and the second has used it to get rid of it from the particle to radial infinity. But these solutions obviously still have singularities, so aren't very nice. So what you can do is stitch the two half string solutions together to give a no string solution. And the domains of these fields change with time. So as the particle comes in, the domain of the inner field decreases, and then as it goes out, it increases again. So now we'll have a look at the inversion relation in 1+1. Schematically, the inversion relation in the ingoing radiation gauge has this form, where you just have four V derivatives of the Hertz potential. But now consider hitting this with a U derivative. We now have mixed UV derivatives there. So we can use the mode decomposed Teukolsky equation to reduce this, as the highest order term is a mixed derivative and all the others are lowers. And if we do this, something remarkable happens. You get a third order ODE because all of the U derivatives cancel. And we're not sure why this happens, but we are looking into it. So if you do the same thing again, take another U derivative, and then use the Teukolsky equation again, you get from the third order ODE to a second order ODE. And again, all the U derivatives cancel. And if we try it again, unfortunately, the U derivatives don't cancel this time, but you get a first order PDE out of it. And this is a lot nicer than a fourth order ODE that we'd have to solve originally. So now we'll move on to the jumps in the Hertz potential. So we define the jump in the field as the difference in the values of the field as each field tends towards the radius of the particle. So as here, phi minus comes this way and phi plus comes this way. So the way we get these jumps is we look at the proper time derivatives of the field. And here, VP and UP are just the Eddington-Finkelstein coordinates along the orbit. We go from the first to the second line by using the first order PDE here to get rid of the U derivative. And we get this result. We can then look at the second proper time derivative and get this result having already used this result. And then the second line we get from using the second order ODE here. So we now have two equations, and we can use these to eliminate the jump in the V derivative of the field, and we get this ODE here. And this is just schematic, as again, A, B, and Calf are horrible and can't really be written down. So what happens when we try to solve this? Well, there's a problem. We get exponentially growing modes when we try to solve it numerically. And when we look closer at the ODE, you can see that there are asymptotic homogeneous solutions which grow and decay exponentially with the proper time. So the way we can get around this is we convert to a hierarchy of first order ODEs. And these ODEs are equivalent to the second order ODE, where A, B, and F are here, and then they appear again here. And if we look at the homogeneous solutions here, then you can see alpha and beta decay exponentially with proper time, whereas the jump in the Hertz potential grows exponentially. But you can get around this by integrating the opposite direction to the blow up so that it's not seeded. And then to do this, we first numerically integrate for alpha and then beta, and then the jump in the Hertz potential. And when we get solutions for this, you can see it's nice. There's no exponential blow up and it's a nice smooth curve. So now let's move on to how we actually get the Hertz potential. Well, it's similar to what Meki spoke about yesterday with a null UV grid. You have initial conditions on the first row of each U and V coordinate. And these produce, we don't really care what's here. It just produces junk data which decays away. And we just take the solution at a late enough time so that this junk data has decayed away. Though we found a problem when we tried to do this for the circular particle case. We found divergent modes at late time with the particle. We then tried it with vacuum and these modes were still present. So if you look here, for s equals +2 Teukolsky, you see an exponential growth here. And for s equals -2, you see a t to the 4 growth. So these comes from non-physical asymptotic solutions of the Teukolsky equation. From the horizon, you get exponential modes. When s equals +2, these grow. And for s equals -2, you get waves coming from null infinity as t to the 4. Now, usually these terms are removed by physical boundary conditions, but as we aren't using boundary conditions, then these are free to be seeded by numerical error. And both of these asymptotic solutions originate from the phi comma t term in the Teukolsky equation. So how do you avoid these? Other Teukolsky codes have imposed boundary conditions, and which will get rid of them, and others have done hyperboloidal slicing, and the same issues haven't been reported by those methods, so they must get rid of them. But what we're going to look at is removing this phi comma t term. So how do we do that? We transform to a Reggie-Wheeler form using a time domain Chandrasekhar transformation, where here x is a Reggie-Wheeler variable that solves a Reggie-Wheeler-like variable that solves this equation. So when we do this and put this into the evolution code and then convert back to the Hertz potential, we get this result here. Whereas you can see you've got the normal, quasi-normal mode decay as expected, and then you have round-off error towards late time. So we can use, so this is for vacuum. What about for particles? We can use a similar method to as we use with the inversion relation to get the jumps in the Hertz potential, to get the jumps in the Reggie-Wheeler field by hitting this Chandrasekhar transformation with a V derivative and then using the Reggie-Wheeler equation, and again using the proper time derivatives of the jump in the Reggie-Wheeler variable, and we get this first order ODE. And this, just as a sanity check, this has asymptotic solutions that decay with tau, so we know they'll be finite. And I'll just quickly put this up just to show you. This is for the circular point particle case, and here you can see this side is all the junk data that we don't care about. You see it decaying, but then for the Teukolsky code, there is this growing t to the 4 mode. Whereas if you look at the inset plot at the Reggie-Wheeler variable, there's just the decay of the junk, and then there's no late time growth. It just goes to the analytic solution and then stays there. So now we'll go back to the evolution code. So we have this world line that goes through the UV grid. So how do we deal with this? So there are 4 different kinds of cells to do with the particle, which depend on where the particle crosses in and out of the cell. So here we'd have the normal finite difference scheme, where the first term is just what you'd expect. And then we also have jumps, which take into account how the particle crosses the cell. These haven't been derived yet, but we don't think they should be too hard to get. And also we have a finite difference scheme to go from Reggie Wheeler back to the Hertz potential. And again, we have jumps here, which we expect. So to conclude, self-force scattering is needed to give information for exact PM calculations, but also for comparison with the scattering amplitude community and benchmarking for the strong field regime without the need for PN or PM calculations. The 4th order inversion relation in 1+1 can be written as a 2nd order ODE or 1st order PDE, which is much nicer than the 4th order ODE that its original form is. We have that the solution of the Teukolsky equation is numerically unstable without boundary conditions, but we can solve this by transforming to a Reggie Wheeler-like variable. So the work plan for the future is to do a full evolution for a scattering orbit of the Hertz potential. We then want to evaluate the self-force using mode sum regularization, and then calculate the correction to the scatter angle from that. So that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Ollie, for that tour de force talk. Very interesting results. We have time for questions. Yeah, go for it, Jieshan.
Okay, thank you for a very nice talk. So I'm curious about, I think this is very interesting. So for the PM or PN application, it's great to have analytical solution. So do you think if it will be feasible? And also, like, to map to the PN Hamiltonian, what we really need is only the G expansion. So do you think whether expanding in G would help with the calculation?
You can get the PN as well. Hang on, sorry, say your question again, please.
The first part is it would be great to have analytical calculation.
Yep.
It seems like some of the calculations so far are still numerical. And the second question is whether expand in G would help with the calculation. Because all we need is expansion in G. We don't really need the entire the non-perturbative solution.
We haven't looked at an expansion in G as of yet, and I don't think there are any plans for us to. And for the other question, we're just looking at doing it numerically rather than analytically.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Ollie? Yeah, Chris.
Just kind of a follow-on to the last question. Would it be possible to like kind of jack up your impact parameter and kind of read off numerically? Or would that be too expensive in this kind of code?
Well, if you jack up because of the numerical grid scales as the size of the grid squared. So if you'd need a bigger grid. I don't think these will be too computationally expensive, so it might be possible. But for the circular orbit case, it takes like a few seconds, so it shouldn't be too hard to up it. So it might be possible.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks again, Ali. Let's go ahead and move on to the last speaker of this sort of morning session. Let me just say again, although it looks like we've been losing participants as it's been getting later in the evening in Europe, we're going to try to take a quick group photo, so to speak. So stick around after Donato's talk. It'll just take a minute, and we'll just have everyone turn on their camera for a second while I take some screenshots. So be ready for that. And Donato, are you ready to start sharing? We can see your screen, but oh yeah, now I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Let me try full screen. Okay.
That's looking good. Go for it.
Okay. So first of all, let me thank Aaron, the organizer of this meeting, for allowing me this talk in spite of my late registration. What I'm going to talk about is the way to obtain a local and non-local dynamics in a binary system, and by using some recent tool, which is the scattering angle. All things I'm going to show you are based on works I have done in collaboration with Thibaut Damour and Andrea Geralico. So what is the message of my talk? Actually, three messages. First, the non-local effects can be analytically computed. Then there are gauge invariant quantities which include both local and non-local effects. And this can be computed by using self-force. This is the case of the redshift. And then, as a byproduct, take the difference, and you can get rid of the local quantity, the most important, the Hamiltonian you are interested in. And this has been done up to now, up to the 6th post-Newtonian level. Not completely determined, because there are a few missing parameters yet. There are 2 parameters missing at 5 pn, and 4 more parameters missing at 6 pn. But there are useful checks we could have. For instance, the 6 pn check of the scattering angle obtained at the 3 pm level recently by Zwiebern and collaborators. So, non-local effects. It is known since much time. Already in 1988, Blanchet and Damour showed that non-local effects in the two-body dynamics start at 4 pm. They compute something. They compute the non-local piece of the gravitational force. But however, at the time, the possibility to reach a complete 4 pm accuracy from an analytical point of view was only a dream. This dream became reality in 2014 when Damour, Jaranowski, and Schaeffer computed for the first time the 4th post-Newtonian conservative dynamics using ADM coordinates. Crucial for them, and crucial for what I'm going to explain in the next slides, is the possibility to use self-force result. At the time, the available result was the part of the main radial potential in EOB, actually the redshift, and computed only at very low PN order and for circular orbits. But this was enough for them to obtain the full local plus non-local 4 PN dynamics. This dynamics later was confirmed within different approaches, Fokker action by Blanchet and easily computable. First of all, the total action is the sum of 2 pieces. There is a local piece and a non-local piece. The label F here means flexed, because there is still the freedom in the choice of the coordinates. One can work in harmonic coordinates or another coordinate system, but we don't care about this further choice for the moment. Harmonic is enough. The sum of these two pieces does not depend on the flexibility function and is the total action. And this kind of split can be done at any Pn order. This was already known many years ago. But what about the nonlocal action? Damour, Jaranowski, and Schaeffer showed that at 4Pn, the nonlocal action is a time-symmetric functional of the two lines, which has the form you see here. Two integrations over t and t prime of a quantity which is not the flux of gravitational wave, but it's what we call the flux split. It's a time-symmetric version of the gravitational wave flux, as I will show in a moment. And then, since non-local effects start at 4Pn, every quantity you put inside the integral, it's enough to be evaluated at the Newtonian level. There are prefactors in front and also prefactor inside this F split. If you want to go beyond at 5Pn, then the flux split should be computed with the 1Pn accuracy. And finally, if you want to go at 6Pn with the non-local action, the flux split should be computed at 2Pn. All these are building blocks, and there is enough in the literature. For instance, if you have the expression for the gravitational wave flux already written in a symmetric form, the flux split version is rather trivial. It's enough to replace one of the two t with this t prime. And then you have simply to compute this integral. One requires a parti-fini operation with the scale, this R12, which can be flexed because of the choice of the coordinates, but actually is the radial distance between the two bodies. And then if you want to use, for instance, the harmonic coordinate system to perform the integration, you have simply to correct the final results with an extra piece, which takes into account the freedom in the choice of the coordinate. So the main ingredient is this flux split. Damour, Jaranowski, and Schaeffer show that one can conveniently rewrite this integral as a sum of two pieces by simply introducing a new variable. T prime is t plus tau, and then these two pieces are conveniently evaluated separately. At 2Pn, the flux split contains several terms. There are the electric quadrupole, the electric octupole, the magnetic quadrupole, hexadecapole, magnetic octupole, etc. And the one has to perform the double integration over t and t prime, which is called the Delaunay averaging over the orbits. So actually in the literature, they are expressed in terms of the description of the orbit, but one can easily replace then the equation of the orbit inside to have explicit function of time, and then integration is done straightforwardly. At 2Pn, the orbit is represented, in this case, the elliptic-like motion, by using the quasi-Keplerian parametrization of the motion, which is available in any coordinate system. Okay, so if you look for harmonic coordinates, all these orbital elements exist in the literature, and they are given often as function of energy and angular momentum. But one can convert these two variables in any other pair of independent variables. And since we are going to perform expansion in eccentricity, the parameters we have chosen are the semi-major axis and the temporal eccentricities. Once you have done the average, once you have performed these integrations, both integration, you are left with an invariant function because of the Delaunay averaging, which still has a dependence on the coordinates through the parameters by which you have expressed it. So if you were using harmonic quantities, then this is a function of the harmonic quantities. But if you do the same with another Hamiltonian, let's say EOB Hamiltonian, written in parametric form, and you use EOB semi-major axis and temporal eccentricity, numerically these two quantities coincide. So one can, from the obtained results of the average inharmonic coordinates, writing the EOB Hamiltonian in a parametric form, fix all the parameters. This is what is done in the first step. So we know EOB summarizes the on the real Hamiltonian in terms of an effective Hamiltonians, which in turn is written by using several potentials. And in the so-called DJS gauge or PR gauge, this is an expansion on PR, and this is the way in which the eccentricity expansion works well in our case. So this potential have a local and non-local part. We are considering only the non-local part. We don't know anything. We put only undetermined coefficient. Make the equation and fix completely the non-local EOB part of the Hamiltonian, which is shown here, up to the 6pn level. But this is not enough, because we would like to have information about the local Hamiltonian. Then we have to use again the idea of the Moore, Jaranowski, and Schaeffer. So once we have computed the non-local part of the Hamiltonian, we pass to the local one, evaluating a quantity, which in our case is the redshift again, Z1 from cell force, and comparing the cell force evaluation done with the EOB Hamiltonian with all unknown parameters for what concern now the local part with the cell force computation. So this will allow us to fix several parameters in the local Hamiltonian. So this is a summary of what I have already told you, and I can skip. I need the gauge invariant quantity, which includes both local and non-local effect. For us, the redshift, it's easy to compute, and we use this, but any other gauge invariant quantity is the same. We compute by using cell force from one side and by using the EOB Hamiltonian with unknown parameters, now for what concerns the local part, and fix what we can fix about these parameters. Okay, so preliminarily one has to compute the redshift. I have seen the interesting talk of Christopher Munna before. We have been computing the redshift invariant along the eccentric orbit, including correction to the 8th power of the eccentricity, because this is what we need to reach the 6pn accuracy in the EOB framework. Okay, so this is a separate calculation. You can imagine very demanding. And this is the results of the redshift, fully analytical. Now we use, if we use this, the EOB parameters, the EOB potential are completely fixed at 6pn, but only linear in nu, linear in the symmetric mass ratio. I want to point out again that this is exactly the strategy that the Moore, Jaranowski, and Schaeffer have used at 4pn. There are just additional complications, but the procedure is exactly the same. What remains is indicated here with these red arrows, certain coefficients in the 5pn and 6pn part of the EOB potentials, higher order in nu, are not determined. Okay, if you have only cell force at disposal, you must then wait for second order cell force to reach the 5pn accuracy, and third order cell force to completely determine these potentials at the 6pn level. Because we will see in a moment, these terms which are not determined by the redshift, involve also the 3rd power of the symmetric mass ratio. How can we fix quadratic, cubic, etc. New parameters. There is a recent result by Damour concerning the new structure of the scattering angle. So if one computes the scattering angle in any gauge and considers, for instance, here is shown a PM expansion of the scattering angle as done in one of the possible energy gauges, then each term in the post-Minkowskian expansion appears, as Andrea has already mentioned, with a certain specific new structure, polynomial of a given degree. So if you are using unknown parameters, by requiring, you have the Hamiltonian, you put all parameters undetermined. By requiring this structure, you can fix what remains to be fixed. And so you see, this is the final part of the computation, where one has computed all the local EOB potentials, and there are several unknown. As I told you, there are unknown at the level of nu square and at the level of nu cube. And for the moment, there is nothing to do. They remain as parameters. But the number of missing coefficients is not very high. There are 2 missing coefficients at 5 pn and 4 more missing coefficients at 6 pn. So one can use some numerical relativity information or wait for other additional inputs of the literature. We have summarized our results in the recent 6pn PRD paper with this picture, where you see all the momentum are on the y-axis collapsed together. I don't distinguish between PR square and P square. I call them P square anyway. In the abscissa, there is the inverse radial variable, which has a weight by G, the gravitational constant. So each vertical line is a post-Minkowskian approximation line. Then you can see these diagonals correspond to the various PN orders. For instance, at 4pn, you can have U5, but you can have also U4 and P square, you can have U3 and P4, etc. So each PN is on a diagonal, and as increasing, they shift, and it's possible to understand where the new structure of the EOB potential, for instance, of the general Hamiltonian is relevant. If you stay, Andrea has already mentioned this, if you stay at 2 p.m., test particle limit is enough. If you want to go at 3 p.m. U cube, then you start seeing effects which are related to the first power of the symmetric mass ratio. But this is the range where self-force can be helpful. This is kept at the 4 p.m. level, where we can do predictions if in the literature somebody will give us 4 p.m. results. Once you go at G to the 5, then second order self-force start. And if you are not happy with this and you want to go at G to the 7, then you face with the third order self-force computation, which for the moment seems to be very far. Conclusion. So this method can be applied in principle to reach higher PN level of accuracy in the total Hamiltonian, in the conservative part of the Hamiltonian, at least in principle. There are difficulties in the sense that we are forced to expand in eccentricity. Maybe this can be avoided at the beginning, but after a while, it's necessary if you want to go beyond. Then one has to study the non-local in time dynamics of other gauge invariant quantities, like the scattering angle, for example. Not the local, but the non-local. Okay, so one has to pass from a small eccentricity expansion characterizing elliptic-like motion to a large eccentricity expansion. In the quasi-Keplerian parametrization of the orbit, this means that what is sin, cos, tan, arctan keeps the h, and then your series expansion converge very, very slowly. So even from an analytical point of view, immediately one is faced with very complicated integrals, which can be dealt only numerically for the moment. It seems that there will be forthcoming new results concerning harmonic coordinate-based complete Hamiltonian at 5pn using the amplitude technology. I will be very happy. In that case, we can fix our two missing parameters at 5pn and complete the task. I have seen, talk before me, that there are attempts to compute scattering angle in cell force. This is of special interest for me, but I would like to see if analytically we can do something. Promising avenues appeared 1 or 2 years ago, using scattering amplitudes. And perhaps we will have something also in this context. Finally, there are discrepancies still if one computes the high energy limit of our expression for the scattering angle at some PM, any PM order, with the classical calculations by Amati, Ciafaloni, and Veneziano, which, however, are correct and checked recently by Bern. So perhaps the problem now is reduced to how are we taking this high energy limit? Is this done correctly, or we should revise our way of doing it? Thanks for your kind attention, and thanks to Aaron for allowing me this talk.
Great, thank you very much, Donato. We are basically out of time, but let Riccardo ask a question. Riccardo, go for it.
Thanks. So Donato, the static sector at 5pn, so g to the 6 at 5pn, is known in harmonic coordinate. Can't you? I know yes, it's difficult to move from one gauge to the
yes, several potentials, but not the full quantity, have been determined by using other technologies. Yes.
No, but no, the full static sector G to the 6 at 5pn has been. So can't you use it to fix one of the two missing coefficients at 5pn?
G to the 6. What do you mean? G yeah. Capital G.
G Newton to the 6, which is the static sector of 5pn, is known in harmonic coordinate.
Yes.
And you have one missing coefficient in that sector. Can't you fix it by looking at that result?
I'm not sure. What I need is to go on eccentric orbits. But anyway, I didn't check.
No, it's known for generic dynamics. It's not
okay, so good. Maybe we can solve one of these coefficients. What I remember, I try to make a comparison, but it seems to me that was not enough to determine what I need. But anyway, must say I'm not sure. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks very much again. Maybe we can talk more about this in the coming discussion session. I'm going to go ahead and ask everyone to hang on the call. If you feel comfortable, please turn on your screen share. If you don't sorry, not your screen share, your camera. If you don't turn on your camera, that's fine. You'll be represented by just your name in the group photo. And now if you'll give me just a few more seconds of your precious time. We've got one panel. Everyone say cheese. I'm taking your picture. We've got two panels. And as promised, 3 didn't take too long. Thank you all so much. We're going to stop for not quite an hour-long break, more like a 55-minute break now. Remember, we're moving to a different Zoom call for the discussion, so please look in your emails for the link to the second half. Justin Vines has very kindly agreed to chair and lead that discussion. So I'll see you all at 11:20 Central Time. So, sorry, that's not, I'm confused, 1 second. 11:40 Central Time for the discussion. Okay, see you all then. Take care.